Chapter 1579. Popular Recommendations. At this time, Gui Shou naturally knew what Luo Fan meant. Although he was not satisfied, he stopped the next wave of attacks that he had prepared. Luo Fan said with a smile, "It seems that you have really gained a lot. That's good. Take this as your foundation and continue your cultivation." "Yes, thank you for your guidance, Master," Gui Shou said quickly. Hearing this, Luo Fan just nodded. Then, he lifted his foot and took a light step forward. In an instant, his figure had already penetrated the void of an unknown number of thousands of miles, and even penetrated the barrier between this civilized country and the outside world. He returned to the palace and reappeared in the seat that he had sat on for unknown number of years. As for Gui Shou, at this time, he did not stay in the place where he had stayed for unknown number of years. His figure turned into a conveyance light, flashing and disappearing, leaving a long trace in the void. In the blink of an eye, he had penetrated a distance of unknown number of thousands of miles and arrived at the place where the creature with the born Taoism aptitude that he had created was. For him, anywhere else was the same. It was all about cultivation. In comparison, it was obviously more comfortable where the creature he had created was. After all these years, the creatures he had created had developed to the point where they could come into contact with the civilized country. However, in the eyes of the creatures in the civilized country, these creatures were equivalent to the barbarians. Innately, the creatures in the civilized country already had the charm of looking down on these creatures. Between the two, although there was not much war for the time being, there were small conflict. But they were continuous. The creatures he had created also took this opportunity to constantly absorb all kinds of knowledge that they needed and all kinds of things that they lacked in the civilized country. In this process, they began to grow constantly. Although this civilized country was led by the creatures created by Qing Yi and Yu Ji, there were not only creatures created by the two of them. There were also other creatures created by the creatures created by Luo Fan who had gained wisdom by refining magic treasures here. For them, the creatures created by Gui Shou were equivalent to their own kind. Their appearance, for them, was the growth of their own strength. Therefore, in comparison, they were the friendliest race to them. Vaguely, they actually wanted to form an alliance, to fight against the true protagonist of this civilized nation together. As a result, the creatures created by Gui Shou grew faster and faster, because it was created by Gui Shou. These creatures were born with an indescribable faith in the Gui Shou, so they naturally welcomed the Gui Shou's arrival. This made Gui Shou, who had come here. However, he felt even more comfortable. For a moment, he had the thought of staying here forever. However, Gui Shou was intelligent after all, so he reacted quickly. Then, he opened up a small world in the forest and went into that small world to cultivate. After experiencing the process of creating the technique, Gui Shou was now used to cultivating in the small world. Those beings clearly only had reverence for their creator, and they immediately set up the place where Gui Shou cultivated in seclusion as a holy land for their race. The appearance of a holy land for a race was like a tree with roots, like a skyscraper with a foundation. It increased the cohesion of the whole race by more than 100 times. For a moment, the spiritual outlook of the whole race changed dramatically. Finally, after some time, a grand war was waged against the creatures created by Qing Yi and Yu Ji to fight for the position of the protagonist of this civilized nation. In the process of obtaining the position of the absolute protagonist, any race would have to commit countless killings, and they would have to go through mountains of corpses and seas of blood. Therefore, it was obvious that the creatures created by Qing Yi and Yu Ji had many enemies. It could even be said that all living beings of other races were their enemies. The reason why there were no conflicts and wars in the past was that those enemies felt that they were not strong enough to defeat the creatures created by Qing Yi and Yu Ji. But now, with the creatures with the Kane Taoism aptitude created by Gui Shou taking the lead, How could those creatures not seize the opportunity to rise up? For a moment, the entire civilized nation was plunged into a sea of war. There was chaos and killing everywhere. The various civilizations that had been developed in this civilized nation over the years were like canoes floating on the sea, and they could capsize at any time. Such a war was a great misfortune for the creatures in this civilized nation, but for the controllers behind them, the many intelligent creatures who had created these creatures, it was just a change that could not even attract their attention. Among those creatures, perhaps only Qing-Yi and Yu-Ji would care about the changes in the situation. The other creatures did what they were supposed to do, and did not even pay much attention to the situation. Gui Shou actually initiated a war. It's time to teach him a lesson, Yu-Ji said to Qing-Yi in a world. Hearing this, Qing-Yi frowned. His eyes penetrated the barriers of the world, and he directly saw the changes in the entire civilized nation. After a while, he said, obviously, we still have the upper hand in the current situation. Don't worry. How can we not worry? Although we still have the upper hand, Gui Shou and the others are developing more than 10 times faster than us. They would soon catch up to him. I don't want the creatures we created to give up their position as the main characters and reincarnate as the secondary race of the entire kingdom. Yu-Ji was very displeased. Don't be afraid. Our newly created beings with connate Dao aptitudes aren't to be trifled with. They have already started to join the battle. Soon they will also grow up. At that time, we'll see who grows faster. Qing-Yi had a feeling that everything was under his control. This was something that had never happened before. I almost forgot about them. Yu-Ji came to a realization at this moment, but his face revealed an excited expression. In fact, she did not have such deep feelings for the creature she had created. The reason why she cared so much about the outcome of this battle was that it concerned her reputation and the strength between her and Gui Shou. Now, since the situation was already balanced, and no one had too much of an advantage, the battle would instead become more exciting. Naturally, she was happy to see it happen. However, it would be better to create more creatures with connate Dao bodies. After all, there is strength in numbers. Qing-Yi suddenly laughed at this moment. Hearing this, Yu-Ji was even more delighted. This style of doing things was just too much to her liking. That's right. He actually took the initiative to ask Master to teach him a method. We must let him know the consequences of not being satisfied. Yu-Ji nodded. Yu-Ji said, obviously. The interaction between Gui Shou and Luo Fan just now. However, the two of them saw it clearly. They were already feeling all sorts of unpleasant feelings in their hearts, but they could not find a way to vent their feelings. At this moment, they used the battle between the creatures they had created as a way to vent their feelings. They made up their minds. Naturally, they would not waste any time. Very soon, he picked a world and stepped into it. He began to use his own power to create groups and groups of living beings with born Taoism aptitude. After these living beings were created, he directly connected the world with the civilized country, so that the living beings here could easily cross the barrier between the two worlds once they met a certain requirement. They could directly enter the civilized country and take part in the increasingly tragic war. In the beginning, Gui Shou did not notice the little tricks that Qing-Yi and Yu-Ji had used. However, as more and more creatures with connate Dao bodies participated in the battle and gradually began to occupy more and more important positions in the battle, he no longer felt that all his years of cultivation had been wasted. They actually cheated. Gui Shou did not know whether to laugh or cry when he realized this. He no longer cared too much about the competition between the civilized countries. If Green Wing and Yu-Ji did not care about them, he was afraid that even their final victory or defeat would not leave much of a mark in his heart. However, when Qing-Yi and Yu-Ji actually cheated, Gui Shou could no longer remain indifferent. This was no longer a matter of victory or defeat between those creatures. This had become a matter of pride between him, Qing Yi, and Yu Ji. Fine, I'll play with you guys. With this thought in mind, Gui Shou began to act. However, he did not create more living beings. To him, the rate at which these living beings multiplied was already sufficient for them to cope with any changes. What he did was to summon the creatures with the best comprehension and the strongest abilities into his cultivation world. He analyzed and explained the cultivation system that they cultivated so that they would have a deeper understanding of the cultivation system that they cultivated. As a result, their attainments and abilities would be greatly improved. To achieve this, it was very simple for Gui Shou, who had already consolidated his foundation and created his own cultivation method. After all, the cultivation civilization and cultivation system that the creatures he created developed were at a level that was almost unbearable to him. From his high vantage point, he was naturally able to see the crux of it with a single glance. He knew the essence of these cultivation systems with a single glance, and he knew how these living beings should adjust themselves and how to cultivate in order to obtain the greatest strength and the greatest improvement. Because the war was in full swing, Gui Shou instinctively sped up the flow of time in this world during the process of explaining to them. By the time he spent several months explaining everything and sending those creatures out, only a few breaths of time had passed in the outside world. For those creatures, the whole process was like a dream. They felt as if they had been to a supreme cultivation hall, but it also felt as if they had not gone anywhere. Everything that had happened before was just a dream. However, this feeling could not last long. As creatures chosen by Gui Shou, how could they not have thought of a way to confirm it? After a round of confirmation, they were overjoyed. They immediately began to impart the various cultivation methods that Gui Shou had taught them. In just a few years, the strength of the entire race had increased by at least 100 times. They directly reversed the situation of the war that had been suppressed to the limit. Gradually, they occupied more and more of the territory of the civilized country and became the main character in the civilized country. In other words, the creatures created by Qing Yi and Yu Ji were constantly retreating in the process. When the creatures created by Gui Shou occupied 1/5 of the entire civilized country. In the void, an inexplicable roar was faintly heard. Gui Shou, Qing Yi, and Yu Ji's expressions changed slightly when they heard the rumble. In the midst of the roar, the three of them faintly felt that this world was sending them some kind of message. The message was so obscure, so illusory, it almost made them feel as if it was an illusion. What's going on? Isn't this just a game of ours? Gui Shou's expression changed greatly at this time, and he thought to himself. The message from the world was so profound that he could not understand it no matter how hard he tried to analyze it. He could only vaguely feel that the world wanted him to win as much as possible. Similarly, Qing Yi and Yu Ji were also inexplicably surprised at this time. Gui Shou's wisdom was higher than the two of them. After Luo Fan's training, his knowledge was also much more than the two of them. Even Gui Shou couldn't figure out the problem, so they naturally couldn't figure it out. Compared to Gui Shou, who could still obtain some information from it, the two of them could not even get the bit of information that Gui Shou had obtained. For a moment, the two of them were a little frightened. After witnessing Gui Shou's transformation tribulation, and witnessing the tribulation that Luo Fan summoned when he split with the heavenly cauldron of the divine court, they had long been filled with awe towards this world. Under such awe, it was easy to imagine what kind of attitude they had towards the information that this world had imparted to them. Qing Yi immediately made a decision and said to Yu Ji, "Let's go and ask Master." Yu Ji hurriedly nodded. Compared to Qing Yi, she trusted Luo Fan more. Even if Qing Yi did not say that she wanted to ask Luo Fan, she would have taken the initiative to say it herself. With this thought in mind, they looked at each other and immediately stepped out of this world. In the blink of an eye, they arrived at the palace where Luo Fan was and asked to see Luo Fan. A short while after the two of them appeared, the void distorted, and Gui Shou's figure also appeared beside them. Moreover, there seemed to be hesitation and doubt on his face. It was extremely similar to them. Seeing Gui Shou, Yu Ji snorted coldly. Obviously, he remembered the indirect battles that he had with Gui Shou all these years. At the same time, he also remembered that they were at a disadvantage in the battles. At this time, Gui Shou could only smile bitterly. Although he wanted to say that they were the ones who initiated it, he still did not dare to be presumptuous in front of his master. Don't be presumptuous. Greet the master first. At this time, the more rational one easily pulled Yu Ji and said. Hearing this, Yu Ji reluctantly let Gui Shou go. He snorted again and turned to look at Luo Fan above. At this time, Luo Fan closed his eyes tightly. He sat there like a statue of a god. There were faint wisps of power that swam around his body like spiritual snake. From these powers, one could feel that they were completely different in nature. There was a great conflict between them. Powers that should not exist at the same time existed at the same time. Moreover, they seemed to be quite harmonious with each other. After a while, all the powers calmed down and condensed into a sphere above Luo Fan's right hand. All the powers condensed in that sphere, chasing and touching each other, and then quickly moving away from each other. It looked like real living beings were testing and communicating with each other. After this, Luo Fan opened his eyes. Seeing that Luo Fan opened his eyes, Qing Yi Yu Ji and Gui Shou hurriedly bowed down and greeted him as master. Luo Fan stopped them and asked, "Weren't the three of you having fun? Why did you suddenly come here at the same time?" Hearing this, Qing Yi and the other two looked a little embarrassed. The battle between the three of them had almost reached a boiling point, but in the eyes of their master, it was just a kind of fun. This made them not know how to react for a moment. After a while, Qing Yi opened his mouth and told Luo Fan what had happened. Luo Fan was originally listening with great interest. When he heard that both of them had received the information, his expression changed slightly. He said, "Show me all the information you have received." Hearing this, Gui Shou and the others did not dare to delay. They hurriedly turned the information they had received into spiritual light and shot it directly at Luo Fan, although they could not fully understand these thoughts. But after all, it was a real piece of information for them. In this way, they could naturally condense this information and transfer it. Just like that, in the blink of an eye, 3 spiritual lights appeared in Luo Fan's hands. Luo Fan's knowledge was naturally many times greater than the 3 of them. Back on the path of transcendence, he had seen so many wills of the world. His ability to analyze the information transmitted by the world was tens of thousands of times stronger than theirs. The 3 of them could not understand the information at all. With just a thought, his perception was sent out, and he had already analyzed everything clearly. After learning the specific content of the information, Luo Fan could not help but have a rather complicated expression on his face. "I didn't expect it to be like this." As expected, the flowers planted intentionally don't bloom, but the willows planted unintentionally grow. Such a thought flashed through his mind. The information told Gui Shou, Qing Yi, and Yu Ji one thing. The creatures that they had created had the potential to become the true protagonists of the world. As long as they could obtain victory in this war, and completely occupy the leading role of this civilized country, the world would give them great benefits. Moreover, apart from giving them benefits, when the living beings they created became the main characters of this civilized country, the world would naturally give birth to living beings with the same structure as the living beings they created and protect these living beings, allowing these living beings to eventually grow into the true main characters of this world and become the true rulers of this world. Even if the creatures were born by the world themselves, they would still respect the winner of the 3 of them as their creators. Although the 3 of them had received the information separately, the content of the information was the same and there was no inclination. When Gui Shou and the others saw the complicated expression on Luo Fan's face after reading the information and even faintly sighing, they could not help but feel extremely nervous. What exactly was the content that made their usually calm master show such a rare expression? After Luo Fan secretly pondered for a while, he loaded his analysis of this information onto these spiritual lights and sent them back to their owners in an instant. Gui Shou and the others were originally very curious about the content of the information. When they saw the spiritual lights being changed and returned, how could they still hesitate? They immediately received the spiritual lights and carefully sensed the information within. Luo Fan's analysis was derived from their level of understanding, so they naturally had no problem understanding it at this moment. Soon, they all understood everything. For a moment, the three of them had extremely complicated expressions. It was still fine between Qing Yi and Yu Ji, but between the two of them and Gui Shou, there seemed to be a huge and almost insurmountable chasm that had suddenly appeared. Even the faint closeness in their hearts could no longer be maintained. Even wealth could move people's hearts, not to mention this huge reward from the world and the noble position of the Creator who became the true protagonist of the world in the future. In the face of such astonishing benefits, the somewhat game-like war between their creations had completely changed. It had become a real war. If it wasn't for Luo Fan being here, the three of them might have already turned around and personally participated in the battle, instead of just guiding behind the scenes like they did before. Chapter 1580. Hearing Luo Fan's words, Qing Yi and the other two couldn't help but be stunned. Obviously, they didn't expect Luo Fan to say such words. Moreover, in Gui Shou's heart, he even faintly wondered if Luo Fan was also interested in the reward of this world. Under this inexplicable suspicion, his face became slightly ugly. Luo Fan was watching the fire from the other side, but he instantly saw through their mentality clearly. For a moment, he felt helpless and said, "If you didn't know the existence of this world's requirements in advance, you can naturally participate in it at will. But now that you know, you can no longer interfere in this war. Otherwise, you will be punished by the heaven. At that time, even if you win, there will be no reward, no benefit. Instead, you will be punished by the heaven and earth, and encounter the tribulation of the heaven and earth. So, next, before the result of the war comes out, you will all stay here." Hearing this, Gui Shou and the other two heaved a sigh of relief. Gui Shou really understood Luo Fan's meaning, and for a moment, he was ashamed of his previous suspicion. Fortunately, Luo Fan knew that this was human nature. It was reasonable for him to think so, and there was nothing to blame, so he didn't care much. Otherwise, just based on his suspicion just now, Luo Fan could justifiably teach him a lesson. Since Luo Fan had given them this reason, they naturally had no other reason to leave. The scene fell into silence for a while. After a while, Qing Yi then asked, "Dare I ask, Master, what is the reward of the heaven and earth usually?" "It's hard to say. Maybe it's merit. Maybe it's to give you a special identity, or maybe it's simply to improve your strength. As for how to choose, it depends on how the heaven and earth chooses," Luo Fan said lightly. "Then, if the creatures we create become the real protagonists of this world, and respect us as their creators, what benefits can we get?" Yu Ji asked at this time. "Naturally, there are many benefits. If the protagonists of this world respect you as their creators, then you will naturally have an identity similar to the protagonists of this world. At that time, when you go out, you pick up a treasure, and when you cultivate, you have an epiphany. Just by holding your breath, you might be able to break through a bottleneck that you have been stuck in for a long time," Luo Fan said lightly. Hearing this, Gui Shou and the other two couldn't help but breathe heavily. This was a real benefit. Compared to the rewards of the heavens and earth, it was even more tempting. However, this isn't without its disadvantages. Luo Fan didn't wait for them to fantasize and quickly continued. These words instantly awakened Gui Shou and the other two from the inexplicable state of longing. Everyone was a little surprised. Could it be that there were any disadvantages? The downside is very simple. You'll have an extremely deep karmic connection with those living beings. At that time, their survival, it will be closely intertwined with your fate. If they perish, you will also suffer heavy injuries that you may never recover from. In other words, all of you. It's equivalent to being tied to that living being, and it'll be difficult for you to escape. Luo Fan said expressionlessly. Hearing this, Qing Yi and Yu Ji quickly realized that this was clearly a closer relationship than they were with those living beings in the worlds that they had created. In order to leave with Luo Fan, the two of them had to search everywhere for materials to strengthen those worlds. In the end, they were so busy that they hadn't completed it until now. As for the living beings that they had created back then, they were just ordinary living beings, not the protagonists of this world. If that was the case, if those living beings were the protagonists of this world, and if those living beings were distributed all over the world, how many times more difficult would the situation be than before? For a moment, the two of them suddenly felt that perhaps it would be better for them if the living beings that they had created failed. In contrast, Gui Shou didn't have such a painful realization, so he didn't feel much about it. Hearing what Luo Fan said, although he felt that it was a bit troublesome, he still felt that it was acceptable compared to the benefit. With this different mentality, the inexplicable estrangement between the three of them suddenly dissipated a lot. Although it was a formless change, everyone present could clearly feel it. For a moment, Gui Shou felt a little strange. He didn't know why Qing Yi and Yu Ji were so terrified after hearing that there would be trouble. What are you doing? Nothing, we just suddenly felt that perhaps it would be better for you to win, Gui Shou. Qing Yi and Yu Ji looked at each other, then Qing Yi said. Hearing this, Gui Shou was even more surprised. Why? Qing Yi and Yu Ji naturally couldn't say their real concerns. They just said, nothing, we just want to be free and don't want to be tied down. Gui Shou was still a little surprised. But he didn't continue to ask. No matter what the other party thought, in his opinion, such a decision was clearly beneficial to him. Naturally, he didn't want to pursue it. Seeing them like this, Luo Fan said indifferently, why do you have to push and shove? No matter what, the process of the war has nothing to do with you now. No matter how you push and shove, the final result will be the same. Hearing Luo Fan's words, Gui Shou and Qing Yi came to their senses, and for a moment, they smiled embarrassedly. They actually forgot what the current situation was. Luo Fan didn't care about them anymore. He immediately closed his eyes, and just like before, he dispersed the ball of power in his hand, causing the power to revolve around his body again, carrying out some kind of extremely subtle control. Sometimes it scattered, sometimes it gathered, sometimes it transformed, and sometimes it returned to its original form. Faintly, an indescribably mysterious aura seeped out of his body. He didn't even need to control it himself. He had already formed a resonance with an inexplicable place. This allowed him to display some subtle and indescribable characteristics, allowing him to control the power more freely. This kind of ability that could extract all kinds of power and gather them together, allowing him to control them as he pleased. It was what Luo Fan comprehended from the Flood Dragon. Although the Flood Dragon was highly intelligent, its true abilities, such as the ability to disperse and guide the power down, or the ability to return power to its original form after it had changed its nature, were all innate abilities of the Flood Dragon. In other words, it was brought about by the special structure of its body and mind. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan comprehended the structure of its body and mind, so naturally, he had the possibility of mastering the various abilities it had mastered. And now, after these years of research, Luo Fan had obtained some result. Everything in front of him was the embodiment of these results. Of course, he could now do these things that he couldn't do in the past. However, compared to the abilities of the Serpent Dragon, this ability of his still had its limit. It had its limits. In terms of strength alone, it still couldn't compare to the flood dragon. This was something that couldn't be helped. After all, it was just like how natural lightning could easily increase its power to an unimaginable level. However, if man-made electricity wanted to increase its power to that level, even the world's most delicate generator might not be able to do it. Even the most complicated and powerful generator might not be able to do it. For the flood dragon, it was using this method instinctively. In fact, fundamentally speaking, the main body of this method was still the world. It was just that it was guided here by the flood dragon. Luo Fan, on the other hand, was different. He had completely relied on his own research to simulate an approach. The difficulty and intensity of the two were obviously incomparable. At least, at the moment, they still couldn't be compared. Under Luo Fan's control, all kinds of powers were constantly dispersed and constantly reorganized. Gradually, the different powers began to slowly fuse, gradually forming a brand new existence that was different from any of the original powers. This existence became more and more obvious as the fusion deepened. Finally, not long after, all the powers completely fused into one and turned into a world. It was an incomparably strange and mysterious world. Everything in this world was evolved from the power that could turn everything into ice, the power that could turn everything into magma, the power that could turn everything into nothingness, the power that could construct a body similar to the caster, but even larger, and so on and so forth. In a position that was most suitable for them, in accordance with the most stable and powerful method of the world, they split into countless strands and gathered them together. In the end, this world actually became so perfect, so mysterious. This world looked like a bronze mirror, quietly floating in front of Luo Fan. Luo Fan looked at the bronze mirror. With a sweep of his eyes, he had already scanned through all the details of the entire world. Gradually, he discovered that there were indescribable creatures being born in that world. The essence of these creatures was also the power. However, the construction of the various powers was more complicated and mysterious than the construction of other things. It was truly giving birth to life. The creatures that were born had all sorts of strange appearances, but they faintly matched the creatures that were born in this part of the world. In a trance, it was as if all the creatures in this world had been moved into that world. This was completely different from the situation where the creatures that were born in the world that Luo Fan had created were usually in his form. The reason for this was very simple. Because the birth of these creatures was not Luo Fan's will. Instead, it was the result of the natural evolution of this world. This concept of not Luo Fan's will didn't mean that these creatures weren't born because Luo Fan didn't want them to be born. Instead, it meant that Luo Fan did not construct the rules for the birth of creatures in this world. Normally speaking, it was absolutely impossible for such a world to give birth to any living creatures. No matter how powerful and stable it would only be a dead creature in the end. However, he did not expect that in this world, the various powers that formed the world already contained the rules for the birth of creatures. Although Luo Fan did not give the entire world such rules, by relying on the natural operation of the world's power, this world still gave birth to creatures. It was precisely because the creatures in this world were born in this state. However, it did not have much to do with Luo Fan, so it only grew according to the rules in the powers and condensed its body according to its characteristics. However, it did not condense its body according to Luo Fan's aura or according to Luo Fan's will. Therefore, there was this world that was created by Luo Fan, but the creatures in it did not have the same appearance as Luo Fan at all. There's actually such a change. Luo Fan could not help but think as he looked at the changes in this world. Originally, condensing these powers into a world was just the result of a sudden impulse. But now, it seemed that this change probably contained some secrets that he had not thought of before. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan began to slowly guide more power to descend from that inexplicable place, constantly supplementing the world formed by that power, allowing that world to slowly grow. As it grew, the world became more complete. It became more stable. The creatures in it also began to grow rapidly. They became stronger and stronger, and some creatures even gave birth to wisdom. In the process of this creature's growth, a strange change occurred. These creatures, which were naturally given wisdom by this world, obtained an inexplicable ability after they grew up. They were actually connected to the origin of this world, and were able to summon power from the origin of this world that far exceeded the limits of their control. Moreover, the power that each creature summoned was different from that of other creatures. The power that each creature summoned had its own characteristic. Looking at everything that happened in this world, Luo Fan had a look of realization and doubt on his face. That was the behavior of the creatures in this world. Obviously, it was similar to the behavior of the creatures in this world he was in. It was just that the power that was summoned was changed from that kind of power to that kind of power. Moreover, there was a slight difference in the intensity. But in essence, there was not much difference. So that's how it is. I didn't expect that the nature of this world is actually like this. It turned out to be like this. Luo Fan sighed. Vaguely, he had already peeped into the nature of the world he was in. In the world formed by the power that he summoned, the creatures with innate wisdom could summon power from the power that formed this world. That innately intelligent creature could summon power from the power that made up this world. Judging from the looks of it, this world should be a world that was created by that indescribable existence. Only in this way, the creatures with innate wisdom could summon power from that unknown place to control it. This was different from what Luo Fan had guessed in the past. In the past, Luo Fan had thought that this unknown place was an existence similar to the origin of a realm. It was also an invisible existence that seemed illusory yet real, and it might also exist in the state of chaos, but looking at it now, it had obviously overturned his guess. Perhaps that unknown place was indeed similar to the origin of a realm. However, it was definitely not the same as the origin of a realm. It was an existence that seemed illusory yet real. It was simply something that truly existed. Moreover, it was more likely to be the true origin of this world. Everything in this world might have originated from it. When he understood this, he suddenly felt that, for the first time, he did not use any divine abilities or techniques. He finally sensed the existence of that unknown place. One is the sky, the other is the earth. When he sensed the unknown place, Luo Fan suddenly had an indescribable feeling. The sky that he was referring to was the origin of a realm, and the earth that he was referring to was that unknown place. This analogy, of course, did not mean that the difference between the two existences was that huge. It was just to show the characteristics of the two. The sky was illusory. One could see it by raising one's head, but there was no way to tell which was the sky and which was not. There was no way to put it into practice. Comparatively speaking, that seemingly illusory yet seemingly real quintessence that could be sensed and entered, yet couldn't be grasped at all, was clearly not much different from the heavens. Unlike the heavens, the earth truly existed. The layer of soil that could be touched and felt was either huge or extremely small, thick or thin, and could be touched and felt was the ground. In comparison, that inexplicable existence was a real thing. Moreover, it originated from the entire world and was the source of the entire world. Clearly, its nature was extremely similar to the earth. Luo Fan looked up. His eyes seemed to pierce through the infinite space and time, shining directly on a place that he couldn't reach now. He saw an indescribable existence that couldn't be described with words, its scale, its color, and even everything else. That was the kind of existence that could provide great power to all creatures born with innate intelligence in this world. It had always been this way. Luo Fan believed that it was similar in nature to the origin of the realm, yet it behaved in a completely opposite manner. However, although he could see that place, he still couldn't reach it. That place seemed to be everywhere, yet it didn't seem to be anywhere. Its profoundness was even more profound than the combination of the profound mysteries of the true saint. It's a pity that with my current realm, I still can't come into contact with that place. Luo Fan sighed inwardly as he slowly retracted his gaze. After being able to sense that inexplicable existence, Luo Fan already felt that his understanding of the various powers that were guided from that inexplicable existence had deepened. Vaguely, he found that his understanding of these powers had more or less deviated. With a jolt of his heart, all of these deviations were adjusted by him. In an instant, the world in front of him had undergone a subtle change. The entire world had become more and more natural. Among the creatures born in it, the number of those born with innate intelligence had increased compared to before. Vaguely, an inexplicable sense of perfection began to radiate from this world. At this moment, Gui Shou and the other two, who were originally observing the battle in the civilized country outside the palace, were finally affected by this change. Finally, they turned their gazes over. When they saw the world in Luo Fan's hands, there was an inexplicable sense of confusion in their eyes. Each of them could feel an inexplicable sense of familiarity from it, but they were all sure that they had never seen such a world before. It was this inexplicable sense of contradiction that made them so confused. Their reactions were naturally seen by Luo Fan, and he instantly knew why they felt that this world was very familiar. The reason was very simple. It was because the nature of this world was similar to this world. However, they were able to sense the feeling of the outside world from this world. However, because the difference between this world and the outside world was too great, they couldn't immediately connect it. That was why they felt that they had never seen this world before. Hence, they felt that it was familiar yet unfamiliar. With a jolt of his heart, Luo Fan slapped his hand, and the world in front of him directly sank into the void, becoming faintly discernible. It looked like it had become a part of the void. Although this world was condensed from the powers that Luo Fan could summon, after they were linked and combined to form such a world, these powers circulated and complemented each other, forming an inexplicable cycle. This had greatly extended the time that the world could exist. At this moment it was hanging here, but it would not dissipate in a short time. This world was similar to the outside world. From its evolution, he might be able to comprehend some of the mysteries of this world, but he couldn't let it go. Moreover, although this world was formed by the combination of many powers, it was clear that if he wanted to get closer to the outside world, he would need to gather even more powers. This obviously required Luo Fan to continuously experience the powers of more living creatures in the future, learn them, and then summon them to make up for them. Only then would he be able to achieve this. All of this obviously required time. That was why Luo Fan didn't dissipate this world at this time. After merging this world with the void, Luo Fan casually waved his hand, and a miniature flood dragon appeared in his hand. The moment the flood dragon appeared, before Qing Yi and Yu Ji could react, Gui Shou couldn't help but narrow his eyes. There was an inexplicable sense of wariness in his eyes. Chapter 1581. Luo Fan didn't care about what Gui Shou and the others thought. At this moment, he pointed his finger, and the flood dragon instantly broke away from the sealed sculpture and turned into a lively flood dragon. It stretched out slightly in the air, and a powerful aura rose almost endlessly. At this moment, Luo Fan gently waved his hand. In an instant, a powerful pressure descended and directly suppressed the flood dragon, locking it in the air. The aura that was so powerful that it could even change time and space was completely restrained in an instant, turning into nothingness. The flood dragon let out a roar at this moment, and then looked at Luo Fan with incomparable hatred. It said, "You are courting death." After hearing this, Luo Fan didn't even have the interest to answer. He casually grabbed it, and in an instant, the various powers that he had left inside and outside the flood dragon's body reacted, and the flood dragon's body began to tremble violently. It couldn't help but let out an indescribably intense roar of pain. This roar of pain was so powerful, and the pain was so intense that even Gui Shou and the others felt as if they were suffering the same pain, and their expressions began to distort slightly. Then, a phantom of a flood dragon slowly separated from the flood dragon's body. As the phantom of the flood dragon began to separate, the flood dragon's trembling and roar of pain became more and more intense, and more shocking. It gave people the feeling that its body was completely crushed. It was as if it was being reconnected bit by bit. After a while, when the phantom of the flood dragon completely separated, the roar of pain instantly disappeared. The body of the flood dragon also stopped trembling completely. It stopped all movement, as if it had completely turned into a dead thing, and had completely lost all vitality. It was as if that phantom was all of its life force and energy. After extracting the phantom of the flood dragon from the flood dragon's body, Luo Fan casually grabbed it. The phantom of the flood dragon directly fell into his hand, and as it rotated, it had already lost its original form of the flood dragon, and directly turned into a small ball. It was only the size of a ping-pong ball, and it looked crystal clear and mysterious. After this small ball appeared. Then, it started to tremble slightly, and intense ripples of wool spread out from it. The ripples wanted to change the shape of its body into that of a flood dragon, and it wanted to completely change the surrounding space and time, turning into a form that was completely different from its current form but more suitable for its body. Unfortunately, at this moment, under the envelopment of Luo Fan's power, none of that happened. Under the power of Luo Fan, no matter how the small ball changed, it could not break away from its original form. That will fluctuation had no effect at all. After a long while, the will fluctuations from the small ball finally stopped. After a while, a voice came from inside. "What on earth do you want?" The voice belonged to the serpent dragon. However, compared to the voice that came from the WRM's body, this voice was slightly distorted. It didn't seem as vigorous or as shocking. Instead, it seemed a little immature. When Luo Fan heard this voice, a strange expression appeared on his face as he said, "I just want to know everything that you know." As he said that, he raised his hand and gently poked the small ball. As he poked it with his finger, the small ball shook slightly, and one could faintly see an indescribable ripple on the surface of the small ball. "Ah!" Then, a scream came from the small ball. "Leave my will." The WRM's voice could be heard amidst the screams. That's right, this small ball was the will of the flood dragon. As long as it was a living creature, it would have a will. The only difference was that intelligent creatures had more complex wills, while unintelligent creatures had simpler wills. The intelligence of the flood dragon in front of him was the highest that Luo Fan had ever seen since he entered this world. One could imagine how complex its will was. At that moment, under the influence of Luo Fan, there were countless mysterious lights and shadows that were constantly flashing within the will. Those with good dynamic vision would even be able to see the shadows of countless living creatures and the shapes of countless worlds. At that moment there was a soft poof, and a mysterious light suddenly shone out from the will. This mysterious light was so intense, so real, and so substantial. Under this mysterious light, the surrounding endless mysteries of the true saint and the fragments of the great path seemed to be strung together by a powerful force. In an instant, an indescribable power was produced that completely shattered the surrounding space-time. In this shattered space-time, two huge eyes slowly appeared. These two eyes were the size of footballs. There was an incomparably deep wisdom in those eyes. Under the shroud of those eyes, all tangible and intangible existences seemed to have no secrets at all. Even Luo Fan himself felt as if he had been completely seen through by Yi Shiwen. Feeling this inexplicable feeling, Luo Fan snorted coldly. The world that was made up of many powers shook slightly at that moment, and there was already an inexplicable power surging out from it. It instantly descended on his body and completely isolated this inexplicable feeling. At that moment there was a shocked emotion in the two football-sized eyes. Then, a faint voice came from it, "You're not bad. However, there are some areas that you can't touch." Then, an indescribable power descended from the void and instantly enveloped the flood dragon's body and the flood dragon's will. This kind of power. Clearly, it had indescribable power. After it enveloped them, there was a slight tremble. As the surrounding space-time trembled, it was as though an invisible hand was kneading plasticine. Suddenly, an indescribably complex change occurred. Amidst this complex change, the eyes, the flood dragon, and the flood dragon's will gradually became illusory. Gradually, it became illusory. It looked as if it would completely disappear in the next moment. How could Luo Fan not understand at this time? It was clear that some kind of existence had left behind some kind of power in the flood dragon's will. At this moment, he was about to save the flood dragon. However, he had waited so long for this flood dragon, and he had even managed to see the existence behind this flood dragon. How could he let it go just like that? At this moment, he shouted coldly. An indescribable power descended from nothingness, and in an instant, the hall turned into an indescribable cage. It was an effect similar to the power that the longevity turtle could display, but with more complicated changes. Not only could it turn everything into nothingness, but it could also directly create nothingness. It wasn't the kind of nothingness that didn't exist, but the concept of nothingness. This kind of nothingness was even deeper than the nothingness where nothing existed. In this concept of nothingness, all existences would be turned into nothingness, and only existences that fit the concept of nothingness. Only existences that could exist here. Under this kind of power, nothingness was only its nature, and only the cage was its essence. In this cage, all existences that wanted to leave here had to go through the owner of the cage. That was to say, Luo Fan had agreed to it. Just as Luo Fan used that power to build the cage of nothingness, the longevity turtle and the other two people in the palace. They had already left the palace in an instant. Although Luo Fan had asked the three of them to stay here and not leave, that was because everything in this palace was under his control. However, that was because everything in this palace was under his control. Not only could he restrict their movements, but he could also protect them. However, at this moment, a shocking battle was taking place in this palace. In such a battle, he wasn't even sure if he could escape unscathed. How could he guarantee their safety? Naturally, he couldn't keep them in this palace anymore. As for whether they would participate in the fight for the leading role of heaven and earth in the civilized nation after leaving this palace, he couldn't care less about that now. In the absolute nothingness inside the cage, all the useful things and useless decorations in the palace turned into nothingness in an instant and disappeared without a trace. Even time and space had completely disappeared at this moment. Only Luo Fan and the power released by the two football-sized eyes remained in the entire palace. The power released by the eyes was trying its best to resist the concept of nothingness that appeared around its body and wanted to completely turn it into nothingness. Due to the concept of nothingness, the scope of the power kept shrinking. In the end, it only enveloped the two eyes and the flood dragon. As for the ping-pong ball-sized eyes, the willpower of the flood dragon had already been sent back into the body of the flood dragon. However, although the willpower had returned to the body, the flood dragon still hadn't come back to life. From the looks of it, it seemed to have fainted or lost its life and hadn't come back to life yet. "You have angered me." A faintly discernible voice came from the eye. Amidst this voice, the inexplicable power that enveloped them changed and turned into a phantom that looked like an ape in the blink of an eye. The two football-sized eyes were embedded in the eye sockets of the phantom ape. It looked like the phantom ape had grown two real eyes at this moment. After the ape appeared, its body shook and a domineering aura covered the sky and covered the earth. This aura was so powerful and real that even the concept of nothingness couldn't assimilate it and turn it into nothingness. This aura even broke through the barrier of the palace, broke through the barrier of the power, and spread out. It directly covered the mountain peak, then spread through the mountain peak, and began to cover more and more civilized nations. Faced with this domineering aura, even Luo Fan couldn't help but be moved. To other living beings, it was easy to imagine how great the impact of this aura was. Almost in an instant, outside, Qing Yi Yuji and Gui Shou's expressions changed drastically. Their legs couldn't support their bodies, and they knelt on the ground. The other living beings were unable to resist at all and had already fainted. As they fainted, the battle that they were fighting for the position of the protagonist of the world naturally stopped. At this moment, suddenly, a thunderous roar came from the void. There was an inexplicable anger in the thunderous roar. There was a soft poof. The domineering aura seemed to be unable to withstand the anger of the world and suddenly collapsed. It had disappeared for the sake of safety. At the same time, in this civilized nation, all the living beings that had fainted just now regained consciousness due to the anger of the world. The duration of this process was too short, and the speed at which it happened was too fast. Almost as soon as they collapsed, there was a thunderous roar in the sky. Then, the aura disappeared, and everyone regained consciousness in an instant. To the many living beings, they felt as if their hearts had suddenly trembled, and they staggered and fell to the ground. Then, everything returned to normal as if nothing had happened. The many living beings were completely puzzled by this situation. They naturally wouldn't be stupid enough to think that it was just an illusion. They wouldn't think that something unexpected had happened to everyone just now. Vaguely, they all knew that an existence countless times stronger than them had suddenly done something to them. However, not many living beings could put aside their thoughts and carefully consider these problems. Most of the living beings didn't have any reaction at this moment. Soon, they had all thrown themselves into the tragic war that they were originally in. Regarding all the changes outside, Luo Fan didn't pay attention to it. Even if he did, he wouldn't care. At this moment, he only revealed an inexplicable smile as he looked at the phantom of the ape in front of him. The ape seemed even more illusory than it had been at the beginning. It looked like it would completely collapse in the next moment and disappear right away. The ape suddenly shouted, "What did you do just now? This is the anger of the world. You destroyed the plan of the world, and this is the punishment that the world has given you," Luo Fan said calmly. "The wrath of heaven and earth?" A look of shock appeared on the ape's face. Clearly, with his intelligence, he understood how terrifying the anger of the world was. One must know that the world usually didn't show any will. Even if one did something great for the world would only bestow some merit and give one some benefit. Even if one did something bad that harmed the world would only give one some negative karma and make one's luck worse. However, it had never directly shown its anger. At this moment, the world actually used anger, which was similar to the behavior of ordinary living beings, to punish him. This was enough to show how bad what he had done was to the world. It could even be said that what he had done was 1,000 times worse than anything he could think of that would harm the world. This was the only reason why the world, which had never shown such strong characteristics like the will of ordinary living beings, would show such characteristics. As for whether Luo Fan was lying, the ape, who could see through almost all secrets at a glance and even forced Luo Fan to use the world condensed from many powers to defend himself, was naturally confident that he wouldn't make a mistake. For a moment, he was even more terrified. "What were you doing just now? Why did the world favor you so much?" he shouted. At this moment, he was no longer in a hurry to leave. Whoever started the trouble should untie it. Since the person in front of him had committed a crime against the world and received its anger, the best way was naturally to solve it on the person in front of him. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "This is my secret. Do you think I will tell you? It seems that I still have to search through your memory." The ape sighed at this moment. At this moment, The look in his eyes became even more resolute. That look. It seemed like he had to achieve his goal no matter what price he had to pay. All of a sudden, the flood dragon began to tremble violently. No! Then, he suddenly opened his eyes and roared. Immediately after, he opened his eyes and roared. This roar was mixed with indescribable pain and indescribable despair. It looked like an ordinary person who saw a mountain crashing down on him. The feeling of being on the verge of death was so strong that it could move anyone. At this moment, the ape's shadow gradually disappeared. The two football-sized eyes also gradually disappeared. After a short while, the flood dragon let out a final roar of despair before falling silent and motionless. At this moment, the ape's shadow and the eyes had completely disappeared. What's going on? Luo Fan frowned. However, he couldn't tell what had happened. Why did the flood dragon suddenly change like this? Why did the ape suddenly disappear without a trace? However, even if he couldn't tell, it didn't mean that he didn't know how to react. No matter what it was, he had to stop what his opponent wanted to do. At this moment, Luo Fan shouted softly and the concept of nothingness condensed. It turned into a fist and directly punched at the flood dragon. The concept of nothingness condensed, and the power to turn everything into nothingness became stronger. It also became more determined to influence all kinds of things. Under the influence of this condensed concept of nothingness, the football-sized eyes that had been protecting the flood dragon and the ape finally couldn't withstand the erosion of nothingness. In an instant, a hole was blasted open, and the fist didn't hold back at all. It started to really punch at the flood dragon's head. Luo Fan had already studied the flood dragon's body and mind, so he knew very well. Although the flood dragon's real weakness wasn't here, it was the easiest place to subdue the flood dragon and destroy all its resistance. As long as the fist hit this spot, the flood dragon's consciousness would naturally be blasted out. Just as the concept of nothingness was about to hit the flood dragon's head, the flood dragon suddenly opened its eyes. Those were the eyes that Luo Fan was very familiar with. They were the football-sized eyes that had been in the eye sockets of the ape's shadow. The profound wisdom and the specks of divine light in those eyes convinced Luo Fan that he was definitely not mistaken. It actually took over its body? Luo Fan couldn't help but feel inexplicably shocked. Originally, he had thought that whatever the ape was doing would very likely bring him great trouble. However, he hadn't expected that it would actually take over the flood dragon's body. It must be known that to the living beings of this world, the body was even more important than the living beings of other worlds. It was also even more unique. Almost every living being's body was unique. Their abilities, their strength, and even their intelligence all came from their bodies. In such a situation, one's own body was extremely important to any living being, and the bodies of other living beings were meaningless to them. Even if they had the ability to take over the bodies of other creatures, their wisdom wouldn't allow them to fully utilize the abilities of their bodies, and they wouldn't be able to display all of their potential. In that case, it might even affect their strength. What would be the point of that? Because of this characteristic of the creatures of this world, Luo Fan hadn't expected that the ape would actually take over the flood dragon's body. Naturally, the flood dragon wouldn't wait for Luo Fan to think things through before responding. At this moment, it suddenly let out a roar. Immediately after, boundless power continued to descend from that unknown place. This kind of power was the same as the power that the ape had guided down previously. However, compared to the previous power, the current power was more than twice as powerful in terms of quantity alone. Due to this power, the fist formed from the concept of nothingness that Luo Fan had guided seemed to directly penetrate a part of the space-time where the flood dragon was. Without going through any process, it had already rushed out from the flood dragon's back. It looked as if that part of space-time no longer existed. Then, the flood dragon suddenly started to melt slowly. Chapter 1582. This wasn't just a change in appearance. In Luo Fan's opinion, the flood dragon in front of him had completely transformed into the state of an ape, from inside to outside, from top to bottom. There was no longer any trace of the flood dragon that it used to be. How strange! This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. The cage that he had constructed, which was filled with the concept of nothingness, was inexplicably distorted when it was attacked by the power of the ape. Time and space were regenerated in this area. Moreover, it was not just a little time and space. Instead, time and space were constantly combining, breaking, reforming, and breaking again around the body in a way that Luo Fan could not imagine. During this process, an indescribable concept of destruction was constantly being emitted. It was this concept of destruction that was on par with the concept of nothingness in Luo Fan's cage. Eventually, an area that did not belong to the cage was opened up in the end. Sensing this change, Luo Fan had a solemn expression on his face. I can actually take over the body of another living being. Could this ability be a universal ability? He said calmly. This was the first time that this creature had heard of a universal ability. However, as an existence with high intelligence, this creature's ability to infer many things from one instance was naturally quite powerful. Although it was the first time he had heard of this, he quickly understood the meaning behind it. He said calmly, "Of course, this is an ability that only I have. This body is under my control. Not only is it completely the same as my original body, but it can also allow me to exert more than 80% of my strength. This is already enough to deal with you." Upon hearing this, Luo Fan came to a sudden realization. This made sense. The living beings in this world were very special. If there was a universal ability that could directly take over the body of another living being, or even completely transform the body of another living being into his original body. If that was the case, then the terror of this world was probably 100 times greater than he had imagined. In such a situation, however, it was still within an acceptable range. Now I want to know what exactly you have done. If you tell me, this will be the end of this matter. About you dealing with a member of our organization. It will also end here. What do you think? The ape said calmly. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan suddenly laughed and said, "You seem to be the one who killed it. What does that have to do with me?" As expected, you still refuse to admit it. The ape sighed. "Since you are not willing to say it, I can only search through your memories." As it spoke, it suddenly raised its hand. In an instant, the unpredictable time and space around its body instantly combined into the shape of a palm. It quickly broke through the layers of the concept of nothingness and charged towards Luo Fan. This charge, its power was astonishing. The concept of nothingness and the concept of destruction collided and annihilated each other. In the end, an indescribable shattering occurred. This shattering was the result of the concept of nothingness and the concept of destruction shattering together with another inexplicable existence. It was an indescribable place that was dusky. It vaguely gave off a feeling that everything in the universe was contained within it, but everything was mixed together in an extremely chaotic manner. It was a state of chaos. It was this shattering that actually tore apart the very foundation of this world, directly revealing the deepest layer of the world, the chaotic state behind this world. Sensing the huge hand reaching over, how could Luo Fan dare to be negligent? At this moment, he quickly blasted his palm out. The powerful concept of nothingness quickly gathered towards his palm. In the end, it directly collided with the palm formed by time and space that the ape had sent out. The power that the ape had summoned was powerful. However, this was the cage that Luo Fan had constructed, after all. It could be said that this was his home ground. No matter how powerful his opponent was, this was his home ground. After all, Luo Fan had an absolute advantage. With this slap, the powerful impact completely shattered the palm formed by time and space that the ape had sent out. Moreover, the palm hadn't completely disappeared at this moment. Instead, it still had the strength to continue moving forward and slapping towards the ape. At this moment, the ape's expression changed slightly. It had originally thought that its slap would definitely be able to deal with Luo Fan easily. After all, it had already unleashed more than 80% of its strength. This kind of strength was enough to easily deal with most of the living creatures in the universe, apart from its own organization. However, the situation that happened at this moment was like a slap to its face, causing its expression to turn rather ugly. All of a sudden, its hands condensed, and in the blink of an eye, a long rod appeared in its hands. This long rod was also formed by time and space. However, the concept within it was no longer destruction, but absolute firmness and stability. It can actually change? Luo Fan's expression changed slightly at this moment. This kind of attack that could elevate nothingness to the level of concept was also a brand new attempt for him. It was a change that he had continuously strengthened the power that he had learned from the Gui Shou and deepened its level. For him now, all he could control was the concept of nothingness. As for the other concepts, he had not developed them yet. Under such circumstances, the ape in front of him was actually able to apply that concept to this level, and could even change it as he pleased. This was a huge blow to him. It turns out that there can be such a change. After the stimulation, Luo Fan was immediately filled with an inexplicable sense of joy. This change alone was enough to offset the danger that he would face from fighting with the ape this time. Boom! In this conceptual cage of absolute nothingness. For the first time, a sound appeared. This sound was produced by the collision between the concept of nothingness and the concept of firmness. It was a creation that broke the nothingness. The appearance of this sound. Obviously, it meant that Luo Fan had fallen into a disadvantageous position at this moment. This could be discerned from the sound, and it could be seen from the scene. In the conceptual cage of nothingness, the long rod was constantly stirring, drawing circles in the nothingness one after another, mincing the concept of nothingness into pieces. It was the kind of shattering that was only produced at the point of impact. At this moment it was revealed without any concealment, spreading all over its body. It was constantly wandering around its body, constantly changing. It looked as if its entire body had entered a chaotic state. Facing such an attack, Luo Fan's conceptual cage of nothingness seemed to have become a piece of paper. Amidst the impact, he could even see rod-shaped silhouettes continuously appearing on the walls of the palace hall. The powerful impact made the palace seem like it was made of balloons, with layers of ripples, waves, and impacts. However, the ape seemed to have some misgivings. At this moment, as long as it exerted more force, it could completely smash the palace and break the cage of nothingness. But, in the end, it could only affect the cage of nothingness and change its form, but it didn't dare to completely shatter the cage of nothingness. The reason for this was very simple. It was because he was worried that Luo Fan had done something. It didn't know what the consequences would be if it completely broke the cage of nothingness. Would it be punished by the heavens again? Would it incur the wrath of the heavens and deal with it directly? It was precisely because of this apprehension that it didn't dare to make a move even though it had the confidence to do so. Luo Fan was obviously able to see this as well. At this moment, he didn't resist, but just watched the long rod formed by time and space constantly destroying his cage of nothingness. The cage of nothingness seemed to have become a cage formed by time and space, and a cage formed by the concept of firmness. Naturally, he didn't have a hobby of being abused. The reason was that he wanted to comprehend the ape's condensation and use of the concept of firmness. This kind of application was quite enlightening to him, and it could almost be said to be the direction of his next growth in this world. Although only a short while had passed since the ape first condensed the long rod, Luo Fan had already gained some insights and grasped the key of the concept of firmness. Naturally, the ape didn't just wave the long rod to destroy the cage of nothingness. Its main target was, of course, Luo Fan. Naturally, the ape wasn't just waving its long stick to destroy the cage of nothingness. Its most fundamental goal was, of course, Luo Fan. However, as this was his home ground, Luo Fan could appear in almost any position at will. As long as the cage of nothingness was not completely destroyed, and as long as there were places that were completely under his control, he could naturally dodge through these places and avoid being hurt by the long rod. As long as the entire cage of nothingness wasn't completely destroyed, as long as there were still places that were completely under his control, he would be able to easily dodge through these places. Naturally, he would be able to completely avoid being hurt by the long rod. On the other hand, Luo Fan was calm. However, Luo Fan's face was calm. The disparity between anger and calmness caused the ape to become more and more irritated, and the power it exerted became stronger and stronger. Dodging like this will only delay the battle. In the end, we still have to fight. What's the point? In the end, the ape couldn't help but yell. Dodging like this will only delay the battle. In the end, we still have to fight. What's the point? In the end, the ape couldn't help but roar. After all, at their level, the level of power had reached an unimaginable level. In the case that both of them exerted their powers, there wasn't much difference in the duration of their powers. After all, at their level, the standard of power had already reached an unimaginable level. In a situation where both of them unleashed their powers at the same time, there was not much difference in the duration of their powers. In this way, one chased and the other dodged. What would they get in the end? In this case, the outcome of the battle could not be determined at all. The winner and the loser could not be determined at all. In order to obtain an outcome, one had to fight in order to determine the outcome. In this case, obviously, there was no point in dodging like this. That was also the reason. Normally, when creatures of this level fought against each other, they would end the battle quickly. It was rare for them to dodge and evade each other. But now, Luo Fan had chosen this method, which seemed to be meaningless to him. One could imagine how much of a provocation this was to him. Luo Fan had no intention of paying attention to the ape at this moment. Right now, he wanted to delay for as much time as possible. To him, the outcome of the battle was not worth mentioning compared to the gains he would gain from delaying for a long time. In this case, what was his choice? It was self-evident. Seeing that he did not answer, the ape became even more furious. Due to the agitation in its heart, it attacked with more and more strength. In the end, the distortion of the cage of nothingness became more and more obvious. The changes in the hall became more and more shocking. With this sort of transformation, no one would be surprised if this palace, this cage of nothingness, were to collapse and be destroyed in the next instant. Just as the ape was about to bear the consequences of being punished by the heavens and destroy the cage of nothingness, Luo Fan finally burst into laughter. So it's that simple. As he shouted, the cage of nothingness suddenly began to change rapidly. Its strength began to increase at a speed visible to the naked eye. In the blink of an eye, the cage of nothingness, which had been constantly deforming under the bombardment of the long rod, returned to its original appearance. There were no longer any bulges on its surface. Even the loud sounds caused by the bombardment had disappeared completely. At least, that was how it sounded from the outside. It had completely disappeared. At this moment, Gui Shou and the others, who were watching anxiously from the outside, felt that the cage of nothingness had suddenly become tenacious. It was an absolute tenacity that could even resist the absolute destruction of the universe. At this moment, the long rod was still wreaking havoc in the cage. It was still wreaking havoc in the cage, and it was still constantly attacking the edge of the cage. It was constantly attacking the essence of the cage. However, it could no longer leave a mark on the cage. At this moment, Luo Fan's figure had already stopped. He was no longer dodging like before. Instead, he stood directly in front of the ape and raised his hand. In an instant, a long saber instantly appeared in his hand. This wasn't any other saber, but the one that existed in this cage. It was condensed from the concept of absolute nothingness. After the long saber was formed, it drew a mysterious trajectory in a flash and directly slashed at the long staff in the ape's hand. Although the ape had noticed the changes in the surroundings and heard Luo Fan's yell, it was a great thing for it that Luo Fan was willing to fight with it since it had been suppressing its anger for so long. At this moment, it didn't hesitate to shake the long rod in its hand and blast it towards the long saber in Luo Fan's hand. "Are you finally willing to fight?" the ape roared. In the midst of the roar, the long rod and the long saber collided. With a schwa sound, its long staff couldn't block the slash of the long blade in Luo Fan's hand at all. The head of the long staff was cut off in the blink of an eye. The long staff was directly shortened by a section. "How is this possible?" The ape had a look of disbelief on its face. Ever since he knew how to condense the long rod according to the concept of firmness of time and space, his long rod had never been cut off. Even if anything had left a mark on it, it wouldn't be able to do so. At this moment, the person in front of him was clearly using a long blade that could be easily minced by him and could even be casually kneaded by the long rod. He had to be merciful in order to preserve it. Yet, with a single slash, the person in front of him had broken it. This situation simply subverted the ape's concept, making it feel that the concept that it had accumulated over the years was completely wrong. Sure enough, it worked. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, the concept on the long saber in his hand was no longer the concept of nothingness, but a concept of sharpness. This concept of sharpness was enough to cut off everything. As long as this concept was powerful enough, it could even cut off the state of chaos. Not to mention other things, although the concept of sharpness was completely opposite to the concept of firmness of the long rod in the ape's hand. Normally, the long rod or the long saber could be broken after the collision. However, Luo Fan had mastered the key of converting concept. The concept of sharpness that he condensed was much stronger than the concept of firmness that the ape had converted by instinct. Under such circumstances, he, who had a stronger concept of sharpness, naturally won the battle. After discovering that it was effective, Luo Fan naturally made further efforts. As the long saber in his hand shone slightly, mysterious arcs appeared when he waved the long saber, slashing towards the ape one after another. It seemed that the ape was going to dismember him. Although the ape was shocked, its fighting instinct did not weaken at all. When Luo Fan's long saber slashed across, the ape waved the long rod in its hand slightly, constantly resisting the long saber. However, every time it resisted, a section of its long rod was directly cut off. After this happened 7 to 8 times, the long rod was already so short that it could only be held by its 2 hands. At this time, the ape had already discovered that something was wrong and roared, "Open for me!" With this roar, its body turned into a mysterious light and quickly crashed outwards. Boom! This crash directly hit the edge of the cage. In an instant, an ape-shaped depression appeared on the edge of the cage. The depression was directly stretched, and it seemed that it would collapse in the next moment. It was directly broken, but in the end it still firmly blocked the ape's way. Even though it had changed into such a shape, it still maintained its integrity with great tenacity. The edge of the cage was no longer the previous concept of nothingness, but the concept of absolute firmness. This concept of firmness might not be as firm and unshakable as the concept of firmness, but, compared to the concept of firmness, it had an additional kind of toughness. It had an additional kind of elasticity. This kind of toughness and elasticity made it much more difficult and troublesome to break through it than to break through the toughness of it. With a soft poof, the ape finally could not continue to move outwards. It was bounced back by the strong rebound force of the edge and directly shot back towards Luo Fan. Facing this ape, Luo Fan naturally did not show any mercy. At this moment, he directly slashed the long saber in his hand towards the ape's eyes. For Luo Fan, this ape had too many vital points on its body. If he wanted to kill it, there were dozens of parts that he could choose to attack. However, he remembered that the ape clearly had 2 eyes when it first appeared. In his heart, he faintly felt that perhaps attacking the eyes would have the best and strongest effect on the ape. In contrast, attacking any other parts might be more or less problematic. The ape roared at this moment. Its body suddenly shone with an indescribable golden light. This golden light revealed a concept of the coexistence of firmness and destruction. This concept also used time and space as a carrier. In other words, the golden light was actually an inexplicable existence formed by the combination of time and space. Just like how carbon atoms could be formed into graphite and diamond, time and space could also be formed into countless mysterious or ordinary things. Although the existence of the golden light was extremely different from the essence of time and space, under the control of this ape, the two were directly connected at this moment. The long saber in Luo Fan's hand was directly blocked by the golden light. With a soft click, countless fine cracks appeared on his long saber. Moreover, these cracks began to expand rapidly and spread rapidly. Countless fine fragments splashed in all directions and were densely mixed together. It looked just like a cloud of fog. This was the concept of sharpness on the long saber. Some of it could not withstand the impact of the concept of destruction and the concept of firmness in the golden light, and it was actually damaged. It can actually fuse 2 completely different concepts together. Luo Fan's eyes lit up again at this moment. Chapter 1583. Facing such an unexpected concept of fusion, Luo Fan suddenly didn't want to get rid of this ape so quickly. To him, this ape was like a gold mine. Every time he chopped it, he would get a piece of gold. Again and again, he would get another piece of gold. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan did not strengthen the long saber in his hand. Instead, he let the long rod that was infused with concepts break the long saber in his hand. At this moment, a look of joy suddenly appeared on the ape's face. With a slight wave of the long rod in his hand, the concepts of toughness and destruction instantly spread out. In the blink of an eye, the concept of nothingness in the surroundings was completely minced, and an area of the concepts of toughness and destruction was constructed. In this area, the concept of anything else didn't exist at all. Even the fragments of the concept of sharpness on Luo Fan's saber were completely crushed in the process and disappeared without a trace. Moreover, this area continued to expand and grow with the passage of time. It was like a huge mountain was rapidly crushing down on Luo Fan. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan only had an indifferent expression on his face, but his heart was filled with inexplicable joy. He spread out his perception and tried his best to absorb the means that the ape had used. He tried his best to study how the concepts on the staff fused with each other and how they coexisted. He wanted to comprehend this method, just like how he comprehended the concept conversion method from him. You should know. For Luo Fan, the only way for him to improve his cultivation level was to comprehend the indescribable place and the origin of the realm. Then, through that comprehension, he would perfect his worldview. However, to truly increase his strength, he could only rely on the power that was guided down from that mysterious place. At the very least, that was the case in this world. After all, there were countless true divine mysteries in this world. The great Tao fragments were even more immeasurable. The power that a true sage's mystical ability could unleash here was unimaginable. However, it was rather ordinary. At least, in Luo Fan's hands, that was the power he could unleash. Under such circumstances, he wanted to unleash his true power and fully unleash the potential of his cultivation realm. Of course, he could only rely on the normal living beings in this world to exert his own strength. In other words, he had to borrow the power that came from an indescribable place. For the current Luo Fan, raising this kind of power to the conceptual level was his strongest means of exerting it. In this way, it was clear that the conversion of concepts, the fusion of concepts, and the activation of concepts, one could imagine how important it was to him. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan was so concerned about the strength displayed by the ape in front of him, as well as the means it had displayed. Elevate a certain property to the conceptual level. This in itself was already a means of exhausting the origin. The method Luo Fan had found from the ape to convert concepts was to rely on the connection between concepts, from one to another, and to master one of the concepts. As he deduced, he grasped another concept. This was not difficult to understand. For example, the concept of nothingness was actually related to the concept of emptiness, and emptiness was related to the concept of fullness. As such, under continuous conversion, all concepts could be converted from this. At this moment, the concept of sharpness that Luo Fan grasped was converted from this. The concept of toughness was directly converted from the concept of sharpness. The ape did not know what Luo Fan was thinking or what state of mind he was in at this moment. To him, Luo Fan was already exhausted, and he had fallen into the ape's attack rhythm. He was already exhausted. With this understanding, an inexplicable hope surged in his heart, and he gradually displayed a carefree mood when he attacked. As he brandished the long rod, it displayed endless mysterious moves. Under normal circumstances, any living creature that saw these moves would probably comprehend the supreme mystery of martial arts. It would not be strange for one to directly attain the innate zenith heaven realm through such move. Under this move, the entire area was filled with inexplicable shadows of rods, which transformed into countless inconceivable shadows that rushed straight towards Luo Fan, greeting him from all directions. The martial arts that Luo Fan grasped were more profound than that of the ape. The ape was only using its instincts. Although its moves were mysterious and contained endless unfathomable mysteries, it did not have a system after all, and there was no real theoretical guidance. Any of the individual moves were not inferior to Luo Fan's moves, but when they were combined, there would be inexplicable flaws that Luo Fan could take advantage of. If Luo Fan wanted to comprehend the method of combining concepts, he naturally could not just dodge. He needed to fight and stimulate the power of the long staff through the stimulation of the battle. Only then would he be able to comprehend the mysteries contained within and discover the principles behind it. Therefore, at this moment, he had already condensed the long saber again and performed the same mysterious saber technique. The saber drew a series of mysterious trajectories and continuously fought with the long staff. He did not attach the previous concept to the long saber, but the concept of toughness. Based on this concept, the long blade was already similar to the rod. However, it was no longer able to instantly cut the rod into two. However, it would not be in a disadvantageous position either. In this battle, although Luo Fan was at a disadvantage, he could still hold on. Although the ape had the upper hand, it was unable to suppress Luo Fan. Not to mention defeating him, it was difficult for the ape to even escape from this place. Under such circumstances, the ape naturally would not notice anything in a short period of time. However, as time passed, how could it not notice anything? What do you want to do? In the end, the ape finally shouted. As it spoke, he waved the long staff in his hand slightly and then put it away. He only defended himself. However, he did not attack anymore. Seeing its behavior, how could Luo Fan not understand that the ape had discovered that something was wrong? It's a pity that I can't learn such a talent in a short period of time. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Although he had exchanged trillions of attacks with the ape just now, if this happened in a normal time and space, the repercussions would leak out. Even the myriad heavens and realms would be completely destroyed. However, even with such an attack, he still could not figure out how the concepts intertwined on the long staff were combined. It was as if the concept of fusion was innately fused together. They were originally two separate concepts. It was as if toughness and destruction had never appeared separately before. Such a situation where he could not do anything or even feel anything had never happened when he was comprehending the concept conversion method. To him, such a situation was a great setback. He was extremely disappointed. If not for his strong Taoist heart, he might have been extremely frustrated. "I just have something to ask you." Luo Fan quickly cast aside his disappointment and said with a smile. An unsightly expression appeared on the ape's face as he said, "I don't care what you want to ask. I won't tell you anything. It's just some common knowledge. Can't I tell you?" Luo Fan said lightly. "If you had asked me nicely, I might have been able to tell you. But now." "Humph." The ape sneered. Hearing this, Luo Fan laughed and said, "You feel guilty for saying that. If I had asked you nicely, would you really have told me? If I hadn't shown my strength, would you have looked me in the eye?" Hearing this, the ape's expression froze. Obviously, Luo Fan was right. Based on its mentality, apart from its own organization and a few hostile organizations, all living creatures were just scum in its eyes. How could it look them in the eye? If it had asked Luo Fan nicely in the past, it would have beaten Luo Fan into the ranks of scum. Not to mention answering his question, it might have felt that Luo Fan's words were polluting its ears and wanted to destroy Luo Fan. How could it have answered his question nicely? The reason why it was saying this was because it had truly recognized Luo Fan's strength. It believed that if Luo Fan was willing to talk to it properly, it would indeed answer him properly. However, how could the ape admit its mistake? It said lightly, "Now that the situation has come to this, what's the point of talking about that? I won't answer any of your questions now. What are you going to do?" Hearing this, Luo Fan sighed and said, "As you said before, I can only retrieve it from your memory." The ape had said the same thing before. Now that it had been sent back by Luo Fan, it felt really complicated. The ape itself was not a passive person. Upon hearing Luo Fan's words, it roared and took the initiative to attack. This time, it didn't attack with the long rod. Instead, it roared at the sky and connected with that unknown place. Vaguely, an endless power descended from that unknown place. This kind of power did not change at this moment. It was just pure power. This power filled the cage that Luo Fan's concept had been changed by the ape. Although the concept contained within the cage was powerful and unpredictable, it was still just a product transformed from an indescribable power. It was like sculpting an art piece out of ice. It could be auctioned off for billions or trillions of dollars, but it couldn't change the fact that it was ice. As long as there was enough light and heat, it would naturally melt. All the artistic value attached to it would naturally disappear and collapse. Similarly, the cage was the same. Even though it had undergone such a huge change, and its potential had been stimulated to such an extent, its essence was still a power. Since that was the case, it was only natural that it would encounter the same power, or even a more powerful and terrifying one. Because of this, it would be damaged. Naturally, it would collapse from the very foundation. Therefore, under this power, the cage started to collapse slowly. Although the various concepts attached to it were able to provide a certain level of defense against an external force, they still melted like snow in the end. Is it going to perish together? Luo Fan instantly understood what the ape was doing. This kind of power was used to collide directly. It didn't change the nature of the power and stimulate its potential to attack the opponent. It was just like a person with limbs and fists. However, it was using its own body to collide with others. It was a method that hurt the enemy but also hurt itself. It was almost a perishing method. In particular, this kind of collision between powers had a terrifying power that could easily destroy the entire universe. One could imagine how powerful it was. If a little bit of it leaked out, it would be enough to annihilate the ape that was shrouded in it. That ape was just a body that it had taken over, but what Luo Fan had here was his own body. The ape didn't care about this body, but Luo Fan obviously didn't care about it. At this moment, he was also trying his best to guide the unknown power from that unknown place and constantly replenish the cage. At this moment, he didn't transform that power into other concept. Instead, he transformed it according to the most fundamental concept of the cage, the concept of nothingness. He tried his best to transform the power that the ape had guided and summoned into nothingness. He tried his best to eliminate the damage that this power could do to him. Obviously, this process wasn't an easy thing to do. Under that power, the nothingness that Luo Fan's power had transformed into crumbled and was continuously destroyed. Could be said that it was retreating step by step, of course, although it was retreating step by step, compared to the original situation of perishing together. But it was already much better. At least, Luo Fan wasn't affected by the collision of the powers. The impact from the mutual annihilation had more or less affected him. In contrast, the ape wasn't so lucky. It was near the point of the collision and didn't have any defense at all. Therefore, the impact from the collision didn't miss out on its body at all. From the looks of it, it looked as if the countless attacks were tearing his body apart layer by layer. Countless tiny fragments were continuously shooting out from his body. At this moment, the ape had a look of disbelief on its face. This method of perishing together could be said to be its trump card. In the past, it had used this method to take over other people's bodies to kill countless enemies. Among them, there were even existences that were several times more powerful than Luo Fan. However, what did it discover at this moment? Luo Fan had actually refined the concept of nothingness to such an extent that it could directly devour and assimilate the most fundamental and original inexplicable power. The strength of this concept's control was simply beyond its imagination. How could it not be moved? This is impossible. In the end, it only had the time to let out an unwilling roar before it was completely destroyed by the power. The moment it was destroyed, the power that had been summoned by it naturally disappeared. As it disappeared, the changes in the cage of nothingness completely calmed down. The entire cage of nothingness directly returned to its normal state of nothingness. Even the palace outside the cage of nothingness, which had been trembling non-stop, also calmed down. It looked like an ordinary palace. I hope I can get more information. At this moment, Luo Fan raised his hand and grabbed at the void. The wisps of extremely broken spiritual light that seemed like they would shatter in the next moment quickly condensed towards him. In the blink of an eye, they appeared in front of him and lay quietly on his palm. This spiritual light was a memory. However, it was not just the ape's memory. It was a memory that was formed from the ape's and the flood dragon's memories. Of course, after all, it was the product of fragmented memories gathered together. It was not directly extracted from their living bodies. As such, these memories were naturally extremely fragmented. How many memories that were useful to Luo Fan could be preserved? This was very suspicious. In fact, these memories could be said to not exist. Even, it could be said to not be real. It was only formed by Luo Fan using the nothingness concept of the cage of nothingness to all existences that were not nothingness. It was naturally formed from the traces of memories that were leaked at the moment of the ape's destruction. In essence, it was just a recording medium similar to a disk. It was not the true memory left in the body of the ape or the flood dragon. This was also a matter of course. The power of the cage of nothingness was extremely thorough in destroying living beings. This cage of nothingness had the ability to completely turn all existences that were not nothingness into nothingness. How could the living beings that died in it have any memory fragments left behind? However, the contents of these memories were also real. It did not have much impact on Luo Fan's understanding of what he wanted to know. His heart skipped a beat. Luo Fan's eyes narrowed. The memories contained in the spiritual light began to slowly unfold in front of him. By rummaging through these memories, Luo Fan gradually had a general understanding of the world. From the birth of this world to the present, it had been billions of trillions of years. In such a long time, even the birth of every living being with inborn wisdom would take a long time. In the end, the number of living beings with inborn wisdom would be uncountable. With more intelligent living beings, there would naturally be more communication. There would be more communication. Organizations, alliances, and the like, of course, would also appear. From these fragmented memories, Luo Fan knew. There were now at least 30 organizations in this world. These organizations had almost divided the whole world into more than 30 regions. Of course, these were the regions that the ape and the flood dragon knew about. As for how many other regions there were outside and whether there were other organizations, even they did not know. The region that Luo Fan was in now belonged to the organization that the ape was in. This organization. It had a name, Big. In this organization called Big, the strongest one was a living being that was many times stronger than the ape. The ape had only seen this creature once, and that was when it had first joined the organization. Since then, that creature had never appeared for an unknown number of trillions of years. It was said that it had been cultivating something, but it also seemed that it did not exist in this world. There were all kinds of rumors. Apart from the strongest expert, there were close to 100 other creatures that were similar in strength to the ape. Almost every one of these living beings had one or two abilities that surpassed all other living beings with inborn wisdom. For example, the ape in front of him could possess the body of other living beings and exert 80% of its strength. Other abilities that could transform into other living beings and fully exert the abilities of other living beings, such as the ability to attack multiple times with one attack, and so on. There were only things that one could think of, but there was nothing that one could not find. Below these nearly 100 powerful living beings were the living beings at the same level as the flood dragon. In comparison, there were many of them. According to the memory, there were at least 10,000 of them. The memory was really fragmented, so Luo Fan could only get this information. He couldn't find any more information no matter how hard he tried. After Luo Fan went through all the memories, the light gradually dimmed. In the end, Luo Fan's expression was quite calm as he casually extinguished this spiritual light. There are nearly 100 creatures that are more powerful than ordinary desperators. They might even be a little bit stronger than the Gene Emperor. There's also a creature that these creatures think is unfathomable and can easily crush them. Their leader is the one who is unfathomable. There are actually at least 30 such organizations in this world. Thinking of this, Luo Fan suddenly had an inexplicable feeling on his face. Originally, he thought that he had already come into contact with the highest level of this world. He did not expect that he was still wandering at the bottom. This world was actually more powerful than he had imagined. While feeling emotional, he also had an indescribable joy. But this is also good. With so many powerful living beings, I can also get more inspiration and more revelations from them. In this case, my improvement will be even greater. Chapter 1584. After dispersing the cage, Luo Fan looked at the world again and felt that it was different from the past. /////. The feeling of being shrouded in a dense fog had mostly disappeared. Vaguely, he could feel that the fog had shrouded him. He could vaguely see the world from a macroscopic perspective. At this time, Gui Shou and the other two had already broken into the palace. When they saw that the palace in front of them had not changed at all from when they left, their expressions suddenly relaxed. When they saw that Luo Fan was still in the original position, and there was no change in his body, it was impossible to tell that he had experienced an extremely fierce battle before, and he finally relaxed completely. "Master, may I know which enemy appeared just now?" Qingyi asked after bowing. Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled and said, "It's just some trouble, you don't have to worry about it." Hearing Luo Fan's words, Gui Shou and the other two were puzzled, but they did not say anything. "The three of you did a good job. Although you weren't in this palace, you didn't participate in the war in the country." Luo Fan did not get entangled in the previous enemies, but directly changed the topic. We dare not forget Master's words. Gui Shou and the other two naturally bowed. Previously, Luo Fan was so serious that even if they wanted to participate in the war in the civilized country, they did not dare to take action. What's more, Luo Fan's terrifying impact in the palace, which almost turned the palace into plasticine and changed shape at will without any signs of stopping, made them constantly worried about whether Luo Fan would fail. How could they have the energy to care about the affairs in the civilized country? After Luo Fan praised them, he turned his gaze to the civilized country below. At this moment, the war in the civilized country had developed to a white-hot level. The creatures created by Gui Shou and the creatures created by Qingyi and Yuji had each occupied nearly half of the civilized country's territory. Moreover, on these territories, they had already developed extremely prosperous civilizations that possessed their own specialties and could display their strengths to the limit. During this period of time, these two powerful civilizations were constantly fighting and plotting against each other. Almost every now and then, wars of different scales will break out. However, it was also because of this war that the level of civilization between the two countries was greatly stimulated, and the speed of development in this war was completely incomparable in the past. Looking at the speed of development of the civilizations of these two countries, at present the development speed of a year. In the past, it would have taken at least 100 years to achieve the same development after so many years of development. Although there were wars in this civilized country from time to time, the territory of the entire civilized country continued to expand during this process. Right now, the territory of the entire civilized country was no longer limited to the circle formed by Luo Fan's repeated refinement of magic treasures. Instead, it had long rushed out of the limit of this distance. It had almost doubled in size compared to before. Usually, it would take hundreds of thousands of years to achieve such a rapid development speed. However, it had only been a few hundred years since the start of the war, yet it had already completed such an expansion. From this, one could tell that the war was not a disaster for this civilized country. Instead, it was a great opportunity. Luo Fan glanced at the changes in this civilized country and vaguely understood that this was not entirely the potential of the two civilized countries. Instead, the world itself was faintly giving the green light for the development of these two civilized countries. Putting everything else aside, there were originally many extremely powerful creatures in the areas that the civilized nations had expanded. Due to various reasons, most of them had left these areas and given up their territories. As a result, the expansion of the civilized nations did not encounter too many obstacles at all. They only needed to modify the environment, and they would naturally be able to bring the area into the territory of the civilized nations. It seems that it will take a long time for this battle between the protagonists to have a real outcome. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. The strength of these two civilized countries was now extremely close. In the end, whoever wanted to obtain the final victory would obviously need to develop faster than the other party as much as possible. Only in this way could they completely suppress the other party in the end and obtain the final victory. And the time needed for this was obviously not a short one. Luo Fan saw this, and so did Gui Shou and the others. Gui Shou looked carefully and suddenly said to Luo Fan helplessly, "Master, I wonder if there is a way to speed up the speed? If this continues, I'm afraid there may not be an outcome even after hundreds of thousands of years." When Luo Fan heard this, he smiled and said, "That's naturally impossible. To become the protagonist of the world, how is it possible without arduous struggle, without shedding blood, without exhausting wisdom, and without exhausting energy?" Gui Shou frowned when he heard Luo Fan's words. He was obviously not satisfied. This was also natural. Gui Shou was not interested in how many wonderful things there were in the battle between those creatures. The only thing he was interested in was the final result. Under such circumstances, the longer this process dragged on, the longer he would suffer. How could he be willing to hear such an answer from Luo Fan? Qing Yi and Yu Ji's expressions were also not good. Although they were not as determined as Gui Shou to have the creatures he created become the protagonists of this world, they still had some expectations after all. If the final outcome did not come out for a long time, it would also be a kind of torture for them. Seeing their expressions, Luo Fan knew what they were thinking and faintly smiled. He smiled faintly and said, "Don't watch this battle." Gui Shou and the others looked stern and hurriedly listened to Luo Fan's words respectfully. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "Don't you want to know why these two kinds of creatures can become the real protagonists of this world?" Gui Shou and the others' expressions changed slightly when they heard this. Before Luo Fan mentioned this, they had never thought about this. To them, the fact that the creatures they created could be valued by the world and be chosen as the protagonists of the world was like a meat pie falling from the sky. However, they only thought about how to get the biggest benefit in the end. Why would they think about the reason behind it? Just like a person received a pie from the sky. The first thing to do was to eat the pie. It was impossible to study why the pie fell from the sky and why it appeared on their head. Did they do something good? Let the pie fall from the sky. Or did someone give them benefits? At this moment, after being reminded by Luo Fan, they just realized, perhaps the benefits of the creatures they created becoming the protagonists of this world were not as great as understanding the mystery behind why they became the protagonists of this world. Indeed, why did they become the protagonists of this world? Gui Shou murmured. He, Qing Yi, and Yu Ji looked at each other and saw inexplicable confusion in each other's eyes. In the end, since they could not get an answer from the other party, they could only look at Luo Fan in confusion, hoping to get an answer from Luo Fan. Seeing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "This is the answer you want to find. You just need to observe carefully. When the result of this battle is out, you will naturally understand this matter." Hearing this, Gui Shou and Qing Yi nodded, not fully understanding. Since Luo Fan was unwilling, they naturally could not get an answer from Luo Fan, so they could only do as he said. Immediately, they turned around and left the palace, choosing the best spot to observe the situation of the civilized country, and began to carefully observe the various aspects of this civilized country. In the beginning, they did not care much about the various developments in this civilized country. Compared to their level, the various aspects of this civilized country would surpass all other countries and civilizations if placed in an ordinary world. There were even cultivators at the supreme venerable level and countless cultivators at the level 9 pseudo-saints. However, to them, they were still as weak as ants, so how could they care too much? However, as time passed, they gradually discovered various factors that attracted them. The inexplicable vitality contained in the entire civilized nation, the potential for improvement that erupted from the inside out, and the almost limitless development gradually attracted them, allowing them to gradually discover existences that could enlighten them, and even some existences that they were missing. After discovering this, the three of them naturally paid more attention to this civilized country. They also became more and more serious about observing this civilized country. The slight reluctance they had to observe this civilized country because of Luo Fan's order had unknowingly been forgotten. When the three of them left the palace to observe the various aspects of the civilized country, Luo Fan was indifferent. With a thought, he once again entered that inexplicable place and began the process of perfecting his world view that he had stopped for a long time. Learning the ability to convert and fuse concepts was of great benefit to the improvement of his strength and could allow him to maximize his potential. But in contrast, perfecting his worldview was fundamental. If his worldview could not keep up, even if he raised the ability to convert and fuse concepts to the peak, his strength would still be limited by the limitations of this worldview. It was impossible for him to make a big breakthrough. Perfecting the worldview was like enlarging a cup. Learning the ability to convert and fuse concepts was like pouring water into this cup. If the cup was not big enough, no matter how much water you poured, no matter how fast you poured, in the end, you would only get that cup of water. Luo Fan was very clear about this. Therefore, with the opportunity, he was not stingy with learning all kinds of inexplicable abilities to enhance his strength. However, during normal times, he would rather spend more time perfecting his worldview of laws. As he was immersed in that inexplicable state, his body gradually became faintly discernible. It felt as if he had merged with some existence in this world that transcended the senses of living beings. It was so much so that he seemed to possess an indescribable characteristic that allowed anyone to see him at this moment. However, in the next instant, when they shifted their gaze away, they would discover that all their memories of seeing him had disappeared. They didn't even remember that there was such a person here. It was a characteristic that Luo Fan obtained after understanding the nature of this world. Or, it was a characteristic that he had just refined. Just like air, if ordinary people didn't know the composition of air, they naturally wouldn't be able to extract oxygen to enhance their breathing efficiency. But if they knew the composition of air, they would know the proportion of oxygen in it. They would know how to extract oxygen. Naturally, they would have all kinds of means to increase their breathing efficiency. Now, Luo Fan's situation was similar to this. Previously, he didn't know the nature of this world. He didn't know what kind of existence that inexplicable place was. Under such circumstances, entering that inexplicable place was like breathing naturally to him. That inexplicable place's characteristic was naturally scattered. When it was placed on Luo Fan's body, it had already fused with many other characteristics. Its most fundamental characteristic naturally couldn't be manifested. But now, after he understood the nature, this inexplicable characteristic naturally became extremely conspicuous. The other characteristics would naturally be suppressed by this characteristic. When it came to Luo Fan, this characteristic naturally manifested. The inexplicable depth that Luo Fan could enter at this time was already at an extremely deep level. Here, his worldview of laws needed to go through more complex refinement before it could be perfected. But every time it was perfected, the benefits he obtained were incomparable to what he had obtained before. In this way, Luo Fan gradually entered a state where he forgot himself and everything else. He gradually forgot the passage of time. Cultivating in this inexplicable place, all the mysteries that he had comprehended and all the improvements in his cultivation realm couldn't be brought out. The only thing that could be brought out was the advancement of the worldview of laws. Therefore, even if Luo Fan obtained a huge improvement from time to time, there didn't seem to be any changes on the surface. Under such circumstances, the palace where Luo Fan was in seemed to have completely stopped time. All the changes in the flow of time didn't seem to leave any traces here. Time passed slowly. After an unknown period of time, a shocking thunderclap descended from the sky, instantly shaking Luo Fan out of that state. Opening his eyes, Luo Fan's eyes suddenly flashed with some kind of indescribable wisdom. This kind of wisdom was so deep that it was indescribable. Yes, under this kind of wisdom, ordinary false saints wouldn't be able to hide at all. In fact, all their secrets might be seen through at a glance. Luo Fan blinked, and this kind of wisdom gradually disappeared. A sense of loss arose spontaneously at this moment. This feeling is really uncomfortable. Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh. That moment just now was the remnant traces of the various mysteries that he had comprehended in that inexplicable place. Yes, if he could preserve it, his current cultivation realm would at least increase by several levels. However, because of the characteristics of that inexplicable place, he couldn't preserve the various comprehensions at all. Once he left, it was as if an invisible arm had instantly wiped his heart, directly wiping away all his various comprehensions. Although this feeling wasn't like cutting flesh, it was worse than cutting flesh. Fortunately, The perfection of the world view of laws has been preserved. Immediately after, Luo Fan was delighted again. Right now, he had an inexplicable feeling that his world view of laws had become so broad and profound. The various explanations of the chaotic state and the universe contained within had all reached a perfect state. It made him feel that he couldn't perfect it anymore. If he hadn't known beforehand that this worldview was already at the true sage level, he probably wouldn't have suspected it. However, it was naturally different now. At this moment, Luo Fan clearly knew why he felt that this worldview was so perfect. The fundamental reason why it was so broad and profound was that his cultivation realm could no longer match this worldview. It was just like how one would feel powerful when one's cultivation realm could not keep up with the perfection of the worldview. Naturally, one would feel that this worldview was broad and profound and extremely perfect. Understanding this, Luo Fan naturally knew that what he needed to do next was to work hard to improve his cultivation realm, so that his cultivation realm could match the worldview of laws. The worldview of laws was the foundation, but what really allowed Luo Fan to become a true sage still required cultivation realm. This was like a fruit tree. With tree root, the branches and leaves had the basic conditions for growth. However, the direct benefit that the fruit farmer wanted was the fruit it bore. After making up his mind, Luo Fan focused his attention on the outside world. On top of the earth-shattering thunderclap just now, he lifted his foot and took a light step. His figure had already left the palace. He appeared above the void. When he came here, he understood where the thunderclap came from. That thunderclap was nothing else. It was born from heaven and earth, and the reason for its birth was none other than the battle between the two main character candidates in the civilized country at the foot of the mountain. It had already reached the point where the outcome was about to be decided. Compared to the time when Luo Fan went to perfect the world view of laws, hundreds of thousands of years had passed. After so many years of development, the scale of the entire civilized country was more than 100 times stronger than before. The area it occupied was still insignificant compared to the territory of the big organization, but it already had a radius of hundreds of millions of miles. The number of people had reached a point where it could not even be calculated with specific numbers. The strongest cultivators in such a civilized country were already close to the false sage level. Of course, they were only close. These living beings were not the true main characters of this world, but it was impossible for them to become true false sages. Other than the strongest living beings that were close to the false sage level, there were countless other living beings that were one level lower. With just a glance, Luo Fan could already see that there were no less than all the cultivators of this level in the various heavens and realms. At this moment, the many living beings and cultivators were divided into two camps and engaged in a fierce battle in a certain location. The intensity of their battle was beyond imagination. If it was any other ordinary world, even if it was the world that Hun Guzi and the others had opened up back then, the world that could allow one to become a false sage with the profound mysteries of the true sage, would probably be directly shattered and become completely unsalvageable. However, in this world, a battle of this scale could not even distort the void. The place where they were fighting was none other than the foot of the mountain that Luo Fan was at. The entire battlefield was densely packed with cultivators, almost like ants. "Greetings, Master." At this moment, Turtle Longevity Green Wing and the other two noticed Luo Fan and hurriedly rushed over to greet him. Luo Fan looked at the three of them and said, "The three of you have been watching for so many years. Have you gained anything?" At this moment, another deafening clap of thunder resounded in the sky. It felt as if the entire world had started to shake at this moment. However, only existences like Luo Fan and Turtle Longevity Green Wing could sense this vibration. As for the living beings that were created below, they did not feel it at all. In his eyes, they were only his opponents and his enemies. Chapter 1585. It was precisely because they had reached their limits that the two civilized countries set their sights on each other. Even if the living beings in the civilized countries could not see that this situation was deliberately created by the world, they knew that the only way to break through the current limit was to devour the other party. At this time, the high-level forces of these two countries were almost all concentrated around the mountain where Luo Fan had been staying. With their combined strength, it would be a simple matter for them to destroy this mountain. However, none of the living beings in the two countries dared to do such a simple thing. In fact, none of them dared to have such a thought. This was because to all living beings, the extremely tall mountain in the middle was their holy mountain and the birthplace of their civilization. Its importance was deeply engraved in the souls of all living beings, making every one of them revere this mountain. So much so that even their battle was based on occupying this sacred mountain as an excuse. Under such circumstances, how could they possibly cause any damage to the sacred mountain? Hence, at this moment there was a huge defensive layer around the mountain. This defensive layer was the joint blessing of the two civilized countries. It was almost a gathering of the peak and highest power of the two civilized countries. This defensive layer was so powerful that it was even for the intelligent living beings in this world. It also had extremely strong blocking abilities, so one could imagine how powerful it was. Such a defensive layer. It was clear that the many living beings were doing this in order to protect the sacred mountain and prevent it from suffering any damage due to their war. This could also be said to be the only thing in common between the two civilized countries at the moment of this final decisive battle. After this time, I'm afraid more than 90% of these countless living beings will die. Luo Fan sighed as he looked at the ongoing war below from the void. There would naturally be losses in war, especially when it seemed like they were evenly matched. Who would emerge victorious was a battle of luck, a battle that only depended on fate. The losses were even more terrifying than ordinary wars. One could imagine the outcome of this war. When one side was completely defeated, the winner would definitely be completely crippled. They would definitely be completely crippled, and not even a tenth of their living beings would survive. However, the damage to this civilized country was nothing to the world. After all, compared to the entire world, these two civilized nations were so insignificant. With such insignificance, it could be said that these two countries were at their peak, with an infinite population of 1 trillion and only one person remaining. There wasn't even much of a difference. Under such circumstances, the world naturally did not care if the two civilized countries were destroyed or how many living beings were lost in the civilized countries. For him, as long as the results of the battle were revealed, it would be enough to determine who the true protagonist of this world was. Just as this earth-shattering war was going on, Luo Fan frowned slightly. He felt an inexplicable gaze cast on him from afar. Every single one of those gazes had the characteristics of the ape that Luo Fan had fought back then. It contained profound and unfathomable wisdom. His gaze seemed to be able to see through everything as he swept his gaze across the area. The probing power seemed to want to discover all the secrets here. At this moment, there was a sudden thunderous sound in the void that the living beings that created the world could not detect, but to existences at Luo Fan's level, it was extremely obvious. Under this thunderous sound, an indescribable power instantly swept across the entire civilized nation. As this power swept across, the probing power of the various gazes instantly disappeared. All the secrets in this civilized nation were instantly preserved. How could this be? An inexplicable and astonished voice faintly came from the void. These voices were inexplicably strange, and the language they used was even more strange. However, the astonishment contained in them was shockingly similar. Seeing this, Luo Fan had an inexplicable understanding in his heart. This is the selection of the heavens and the earth. Anyone who wants to spy on this selection is offending the heavens and the earth, and will be punished by the heavens. Now, those spies should be feeling quite uncomfortable. Fortunately, my identity is special. Otherwise, I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to explore the secrets of these two civilized countries. Just as Luo Fan was enlightened, the void fluctuated, and figures crossed over from afar and appeared outside the two civilized nations. These living beings had all sorts of strange appearances, and they varied in size. The big ones were hundreds of thousands of feet tall, while the small ones were only the size of a palm. However, no matter what these living beings looked like or how big they were, the aura they exuded was unimaginably powerful. Every single one of them was comparable to the ape that Luo Fan had seen back then. In fact, not only was it comparable, but Luo Fan also saw the ape's figure at that moment. The moment Luo Fan saw the ape also saw Luo Fan. However, what surprised him was that the ape looked at Luo Fan in confusion. It did not show any signs that it knew Luo Fan at all. This made Luo Fan suddenly think, could it be that the thing that possessed the WRM was only its clone? Moreover, it's a clone that's completely isolated from its main body? As soon as this idea appeared, the more Luo Fan thought about it, the more he thought about it. He faintly understood why the ape hadn't come to seek revenge for the past hundreds of thousands of years, even though it had suffered such a huge loss. It was as if nothing had happened. Aren't you part of our organization? Are you a newly advanced expert? Suddenly, a voice was heard in Luo Fan's ears. This voice was rather deep, and it naturally exuded an inexplicable pressure. It gave people the feeling that they had to take it seriously. Luo Fan looked up and saw that the person who spoke was a creature with 9 heads and 13 arms. It was hundreds of feet tall. It had the form of a human, but its heads were all kinds of living beings. At that moment, the creature's 9 heads and 18 eyes were all staring at Luo Fan. The pressure from its eyes was even stronger than the pressure from its voice. It must be so. Kid, I'll give you a chance to join our organization. At that moment, another voice was heard in Luo Fan's ears. This time, the sound was completely different from the previous one. It was not deep and deep. Instead, it sounded hoarse. It seemed cold and gloomy, as if a poisonous snake was hissing. Anyone who heard it would also feel an inexplicable pressure. Luo Fan looked over and found that it was indeed a poisonous snake. It was hundreds of feet long, with sharp fangs. Its body was thick and strong, and the surface of its body was pitch black, as if it could swallow everything. All of the living beings here were experts on the same level as the ape. They were much stronger than Gui Shou and the others. At a glance, they could tell who was stronger and who was weaker among the 4 people standing here. They could tell that Luo Fan was an expert at the same level as them, while Gui Shou and the others were just weaklings. At that moment, they only had eyes for Luo Fan, not Gui Shou and the other 2. Luo Fan had never planned to join any organization. He didn't even want to join the one he founded. Moreover, under such circumstances, even if those creatures tried to persuade him, he could politely decline. But now, these creatures used such a commanding tone. How could he be polite to them? He didn't even bat an eyelid. He said indifferently, not interested. Hearing this, it wasn't just the creature who spoke. Even the expressions of the dozen or so creatures that had just arrived became extremely unsightly. Almost all living beings who identified with their own organizations had pride in their own organizations. To the creatures in front of them, the organization they joined was the strongest and best organization in the world. Now, they were giving Luo Fan a chance to join, which was already giving him a lot of face. It was fine if Luo Fan didn't kneel down and beg to join, but he was so dismissive. This was simply provoking all of them. How dare you? The 9-headed, 13-armed creature who had spoken earlier shouted coldly. Along with this cold shout, a powerful aura emanated from the bodies of these creatures. It was as if a world was crushing down on Luo Fan. Although those beings were millions of miles away from Luo Fan at this moment, for existences like them, this distance was almost the same as standing face to face. Not only was the sound unhindered, but the aura was also unaffected. Crack! At this moment, another clap of thunder came from the void. Then, all the aura that was close to a civilized nation crumbled into nothingness. At the same time, the creatures who had released their auras shuddered. Some of their faces turned pale, and even their auras fluctuated uncontrollably. It was clear that not only had the thunderbolt dispersed and eliminated their momentum, but it had also injured them in some inexplicable way, causing them to behave like this at this time. "What the hell is going on?" one of the creatures roared furiously. When had heaven and earth ever interfered with their actions? Such an inconceivable scene had toppled their worldview, causing them to be at a loss for a moment. Naturally, Luo Fan wasn't interested in explaining to them that heaven and earth were choosing the protagonist. He just looked at them calmly, panicking and not knowing what to do. After all, those creatures were not low in intelligence. Although they had never encountered such a thing since ancient times, they quickly reacted and cast their gazes on Luo Fan. "Kid, hurry up and tell us what's going on. Why would heaven and earth protect this area?" the 9-headed, 13-armed creature commanded. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled nonchalantly and pretended that he didn't hear it. "Sometimes, it's better to make a friend than an enemy." Suddenly, another creature said. This creature looked like a mountain goat. However, unlike ordinary mountain goats, it wasn't covered in fur. Instead, it was covered in scales that were densely engraved with countless strange symbols and lines. It stood in the void, and under its feet, there were all kinds of mysterious clouds that were formed by the mysteries of the true sage. It was unpredictable and abnormally mysterious. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. How could he not know that it was better to have one more friend than one more enemy? However, he knew that it was impossible for him to become friends with them, putting aside the differences in their way of thinking and their cultivation goals. Just the fact that the creatures in the civilized country were becoming the main characters of this world meant that Luo Fan couldn't walk the same path as them. One had to know. Before these creatures became the real main characters of this world, these creatures with innate intelligence could be said to be the main characters of this world. They enjoyed all the treatment that the main characters of this world deserve. Under such circumstances, when the creatures in the civilized country became the main characters of this world, these creatures with innate intelligence would instinctively view them as enemies, and the endless attacks would begin to fall on them. When that time came, the two sides would naturally become absolute opposites under the push of heaven and earth. And in this opposition, these creatures with innate intelligence would become fewer and weaker. On the other hand, the creatures in the civilized country would become stronger and stronger. In the end, the creatures in the civilized country would reach the point where all the innate intelligent creatures were reduced to secondary races or even become beasts. Only then would they stop. This process might take billions of trillions of years to complete. But it was almost an inevitable process. As long as heaven and earth truly recognized a certain type of creature in the civilized country as the main characters of this world, this process would be irreversible and unchangeable. Even if these creatures found an opportunity to completely annihilate all the creatures in the civilized country, the final result would definitely be that this world would naturally give birth to creatures of the same race as the creatures in the civilized country. They would start anew in other places and develop again, once again attacking the ruling position of these creatures with innate intelligence, and so on and so forth, until the final result was completely out. This fundamental contradiction made Luo Fan know that no matter what kind of friendship he had with them, no matter how well he discussed with them, when the final result was out, they would instinctively turn against him. Under such circumstances, why should Luo Fan make himself suffer to please these creatures? Especially when these creatures couldn't do anything to him. Maybe so, but we won't be friends, Luo Fan said calmly. Hearing this, the light of wisdom in the eyes of the goat-like creature flowed endlessly. It seemed to be investigating something. In a trance, it seemed to have gained something, but it also seemed like it didn't get anything. When Luo Fan saw this, his heart trembled slightly. This goat-like living being was the most similar to the false sage that he had encountered before. It was just like other creatures. Although they weren't much weaker than this goat in terms of intelligence, those creatures used intelligence more as a means of fighting. Even if they had intelligence, their behavior was similar to that of beasts, and they still acted more according to their instincts. Only this goat-like creature knew how to use intelligence to command all of its actions. It knew how to use intelligence to carefully analyze all kinds of things in the outside world. This was the behavior of normal creatures with intelligence in other worlds, arrogant. Another creature shouted. That creature looked like a huge palm. The eyes, the mouth, and the nose were all grown on the palm. After it roared like this, it didn't hesitate to guide the power from that unknown place to descend. It directly turned into a huge palm in the void. With a concept of annihilation, it directly slapped toward Luo Fan. The shape of this palm looked very similar to its body. However, it was more detailed and vivid. As it changed in the void, it directly caused the surrounding time, space, true sage mysteries, and great Tao fragments to produce inexplicable changes. The concept of annihilation continued to spread, causing the outline of the palm to gradually appear, making its power seem more and more powerful. This kind of power directly affected the civilized country below. In an instant, the buildings in the civilized country began to tremble slightly. There were even faint signs of collapse and destruction. In fact, there were even creatures in the civilized country who couldn't withstand the invasion of the concept of annihilation in the process, and their bodies collapsed. Destruction, at this moment, a cloud that was completely invisible to the eyes of the creature that created it appeared in the sky out of nowhere. However, to a creature at Luo Fan's level, it was extremely obvious. The moment this cloud appeared, an indescribable pressure descended out of nowhere. This pressure directly affected Luo Fan and those creatures. However, it didn't affect the endless creatures in the civilized country below. This kind of pressure made even Luo Fan faintly feel a little aghast. For them, it didn't exist at all. Under this pressure, the inexplicable power that was guided and summoned by the palm-shaped creature instantly collapsed. The concept of annihilation was also eliminated by this inexplicable pressure in the blink of an eye. It felt as if it had never appeared in the first place. Then, the palm-shaped creature let out a mournful cry. Its body was like ice under the sun. It began to melt bit by bit. During this process, no matter how hard the creature tried to summon its power to resist or how hard it tried to guide the inexplicable power to descend, it couldn't slow down the melting process at all. At this moment, it could only watch its body disappear bit by bit and be destroyed bit by bit. As such a powerful creature, it let out such a mournful cry at this moment. One could imagine how shocking this was to all the creatures present. For a moment, the other creatures around the creature couldn't help but look terrified. They kept retreating, resisting the inexplicable pressure produced by the cloud, and tried their best to stay away from the melting creature. The scream lasted for dozens of breaths before it stopped. By the time the scream stopped, it was already too late. All traces of the palm-shaped creature's existence had been completely erased, as if it had never existed in this world. At the same time, the cloud in the sky silently disappeared, just like how it had appeared in the beginning. As the cloud disappeared, the inexplicable pressure on Luo Fan and the others also disappeared. However, at this moment, although the pressure on their bodies had already disappeared, the pressure in the hearts of those creatures had become unprecedentedly strong. In the short span of a few dozen breaths, a living being that was similar to them had all traces of its existence erased by heaven and earth, and the reason for this was merely the aftermath of the attack that had injured this strange area. To them, this was simply as absurd as an ordinary person being sentenced to death for stepping on an ant. Of course, while they felt that it was ridiculous, they also realized that the area below was far more important to this world than them. "Looks like the world is going to change," the goat-like creature sighed. As one of the few creatures that knew how to use intelligence, the goat-like creature's thought process was many times more rigorous than that of other creatures. Through the various changes just now, it deduced all sorts of outcomes and finally came to this conclusion. What's going on? Why is this happening? When the other creatures saw that the goat seemed to have gained something, they all asked it anxiously. At this moment, Luo Fan also focused his attention on the goat. However, he wanted to know what the result of its divination was. "Perhaps the creatures here are the darlings of heaven and earth. They should be replacing us," the goat said with a sorrowful expression. Hearing this, Luo Fan could not help but look sideways. It was just an extremely small piece of information, but the goat was actually able to deduce such a result. It seemed like the extent of its use of intelligence was deeper than he had imagined. "Impossible? We're the darlings of heaven and earth." At this moment, the other creatures instinctively shouted and retorted. Their rebuttal was almost instinctive, and it was a rebuttal without any thought. There was no other reason. If what the goat said was true, it would be like a bolt from the blue to them. Chapter 1587. Even if they didn't want to believe it, the truth was the truth. These creatures weren't without intelligence. How could they not know whether the goat's deduction was based on facts or not? Although they kept saying that it was impossible, an inexplicable hatred gradually grew in their hearts. It was directed at the many creatures in this civilized country at this moment. Of course, because this world had cleanly wiped out the palm-like creature, it seemed that these creatures were still trying their best to restrain their hatred. They didn't let the power of this hatred erupt. It should be known that for these creatures that were even stronger than the Desperters, even their hatred was enough to distort time and space and distort the world. If these creatures didn't have the power to restrain their hatred, the entire civilized country wouldn't be completely destroyed, but it was inevitable that more than half of it would be destroyed. Of course, in this way they would definitely be oppressed by this world. At that time, it wouldn't be inconceivable for them to die like the palm-like creature. Luo Fan looked at their performance and knew that his guess was right. He couldn't help but sigh slightly. Now was still the time to decide the protagonist of this world, and the world was protecting the creatures in this civilized country. But when this decision was made, when the war in this civilized country stopped, the protection of the world would naturally disappear. At that time, what should the creatures in this civilized country use to fight against these creatures? It seems that I have no choice but to make a move, Luo Fan thought to himself as he sighed. Although these creatures were nothing to him, they were nothing. But the existence of these living beings meant that he was destined to stand on the opposite side of these many living beings. For these creatures, as an existence that was similar to the new protagonist of this world and stood on the same side, Luo Fan was obviously the same as the creatures in the civilized country in their eyes. Under such circumstances, one could imagine their attitude toward Luo Fan. Even if Luo Fan didn't want to fight with them, they would definitely take the initiative to attack. Let's not talk about anything else and just talk about this moment. These creatures looked at Luo Fan with an indescribable hatred in their eyes. Since he knew that a battle was unavoidable, Luo Fan naturally would not hesitate. If they fought later, it would be a pure confrontation of strength, but if they fought now, on the other hand, he could still obtain some protection from the heavens and earth. Was there a need to say when he would choose to act? As all sorts of thoughts flashed through his mind, Luo Fan did not hesitate to take a step forward. In the blink of an eye, he had already charged into the crowd. The dozen or so living beings were originally planning how to stop Luo Fan before wiping out all the living beings in this civilized country. When they suddenly realized that Luo Fan had appeared beside them, the impact made their expressions change drastically. At this moment, what emerged in their hearts was not to attack Luo Fan. Instead, it was the entire process of the palm-like being melting. As soon as this scene appeared, they instinctively began to retreat. In the blink of an eye, with a swoosh, the place where the dozen or so living beings had gathered became empty in the blink of an eye. Only Luo Fan was left floating in midair. When Luo Fan saw their behavior, he did not know whether to laugh or cry. However, their hesitation was a good thing for him. He directly targeted the 9-headed, 13-armed living being. In his heart, an inexplicable power was instantly guided down from that inexplicable place. In the void, it turned into a concept of absolute sharpness and condensed into countless long sabers that pounced towards the 9-headed, 13-armed living being. This concept of sharpness was extremely pure and powerful. Under it, everything in the void was directly sliced apart. Whether it was the true divine mysteries, the great Tao fragments, time, or space, there were no accidents. After the long saber with the concept of sharpness passed by, a faint gray chaotic state appeared from the crack. Almost as soon as the long saber appeared, it had already appeared around the 9-headed, 13-armed living being and directly pierced every inch of its body. If even the true divine mysteries could be directly sliced apart, one could imagine what the outcome would be if this living being was directly pierced. In the face of this life-or-death crisis, the 9-headed, 13-armed living being no longer cared whether Luo Fan would be protected by the world like the living beings in the civilized country. In an instant, it guided the inexplicable power from that inexplicable place down. In the blink of an eye, an incomparably sturdy layer of armor condensed on its body. This layer of armor was extremely strange, and its shape was unpredictable. It seemed to reveal the concept of absolute defense. It was as if even if the world was destroyed, even the chaotic state would not be able to shake it. However, it seemed to be constantly changing, as if it could not be stabilized at all. Chi, the long saber with the concept of sharpness directly collided with the armor, causing a soft sound to be heard. The armor actually blocked the concept of sharpness from the saber with ease. Moreover, after that, it did not just stop after blocking the saber. Instead, it directly reversed the attack and directly reflected the destructive force. Along some inexplicable and mysterious path, it directly landed on Luo Fan's body. Moreover, the attack and the power seemed to be exactly the same as the long saber that Luo Fan had used previously. In Luo Fan's opinion, the moment the armor appeared, it seemed as if countless long sabers with the concept of sharpness were also pointing at every part of his body, and he was about to be dismembered. It actually directly reversed the attack? This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind at this moment. Fortunately, the reversed attack seemed to still be the original attack, and Luo Fan had absolute control over the concept of sharpness that he had condensed. At this moment, when the long saber approached his body, he instinctively controlled it and released it. He instantly controlled the concept of sharpness, and with a slight concept change, all the concept of sharpness was converted into a concept of gentleness, so that the long saber directly pounced on his body and melted into a mass of water, wrapping around him. No divine retribution? At this moment, several joyful voices were heard. Among these voices, the most joyful one was the voice that came from the mouth of the 9-headed, 13-armed creature. After all, when this creature instinctively resisted, he had already mentally prepared himself to be completely erased by the hatred of the world. However, because of the unwillingness and anger in his heart, he thought that even if he died, he would definitely teach Luo Fan a lesson. He directly dragged him along with him before launching an attack. In such a situation, he suddenly discovered that the situation was not as bad as he had imagined. He still had the qualifications to attack his opponent. This feeling was truly as if he had returned from death. One could imagine how great the impact on his spirit was. Perhaps, it's just that because it can't threaten my life, the world didn't react. Luo Fan could not help but laugh when he saw the eager expressions on the faces of the surrounding creatures. He said, Hearing this, the expressions of the dozen or so creatures changed slightly. This situation was not impossible. The palm-like creature clearly did not get erased by the world because he showed signs of attacking Luo Fan. It was clearly because in the process of attacking Luo Fan, the aftermath of his power had harmed the civilized country below and destroyed many of the creatures in the civilized country. That was why he was doomed. If one had to deduce from the details, perhaps attacking the person in front of them. Indeed, it was possible that he would not receive retribution and be doomed. However, if he harmed this person's life, that might not necessarily be the case. Thinking of this, the creatures that were originally prepared to attack stopped in an instant. However, of course, they would not continue their previous actions of escaping. Instead, they stopped there, looking a little hesitant. Seeing their hesitation, Luo Fan snickered inwardly. He knew very well that the world would not treat him the same way it treated the creatures in the civilized country. No matter what he encountered, the world would not stand up for him. Now that he had captured these creatures with these words and instantly dispelled their encirclement, that feeling was simply too wonderful. Since these creatures were hesitating, Luo Fan did not hold back. He raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. The long blade that had been destroyed when it collided with the armor on the surface of the 9-headed, 13-armed creature's body instantly transformed into the concept of toughness. It condensed into a palm and fiercely grabbed at the 9-headed, 13-armed creature. At this moment, the 9-headed, 13-armed creature roared. The armor on the surface of its body also changed at this moment, turning into a concept that could destroy everything. It turned into a giant cone and charged at the palm. When a certain property was raised to the concept level, its power had already been raised to an unbelievable level. The damage and impact it had on the surrounding environment had also been raised to an unimaginable level. Just like at this very moment, although the palm Luo Fan condensed and the sharp all condensed by the 9-headed, 13-armed creature were both targeting their opponents and their own enemies, they directly destroyed the surrounding space and time. An area of absolute nothingness that had no time, no space, no true saint mysteries, and no great Tao fragments was formed. This area of nothingness was not created by the power that Luo Fan had summoned down. Therefore, there was no concept of nothingness here. There was only pure nothingness. As soon as such nothingness was born, it naturally withstood the powerful pressure of the surrounding world. It began to be constantly attacked and destroyed, and it was constantly replenished and filled by various substances in the surroundings. However, at this moment, when the forms formed by the two concepts collided with each other, the nothingness only continued to expand and could not shrink at all. The moment the cone and the palm came into contact, a layer of strange light was emitted. The two concepts were opposing each other. At this moment, when they collided, it was obvious that the strength of the two concepts could be seen. Needless to say, Luo Fan, his research on this concept had already reached the point where he could transform it at will. Naturally, his understanding of this concept was extremely deep. The strength of this concept, because of his understanding, it had naturally reached an unbelievable level. Although the 9-headed, 13-armed creature did not have a deep understanding of the essence of this concept like Luo Fan did, its powerful instincts were enough to allow it to transform this concept to an unimaginable level. It was enough to make the concept of destruction on the sharp all comparable to the concept of toughness on the palm. In this situation where they were in a stalemate, the result of the collision of the two concepts, they were annihilated at the same time. The two concepts crumbled. Those bits and pieces of concepts destroyed everything in the surroundings more and more. And during this process, it continued to spread out. It seemed that it was about to affect the range of the civilized country, and it was about to touch the nerves of this world. At this moment, the 9-headed, 13-armed creature was scared out of its wits. It didn't know whether killing Luo Fan would cause it to be punished by the heavens and erased by the tribulations of heaven and earth. However, when these concepts with absolute destructive power crashed into the range of the civilized country, would it cause the reaction of heaven and earth? Would heaven and earth erase them? There was no doubt about this. The palm-like creature had given it the most obvious example. Under such circumstances, seeing these tiny concepts about to crash into the range of the civilized country, how could the 9-headed, 13-armed creature not be anxious? No! It roared. As its power erupted, it guided some unknown power. It began to gather those tiny bits of power, trying to prevent them from affecting the range of the civilized country. At this moment, Luo Fan smiled. He raised his hand and patted the void. Another wave of inexplicable power was guided down by him from that unknown place, and it slapped towards the 9-headed, 13-armed creature. Luo Fan didn't care about the tiny bits of power pouring into the civilized country. The reason was none other than the concept he had condensed on the palm. It was the concept of toughness. Although this concept was condensed, under his control, it would possess unimaginable destructive power, but if he didn't control it normally, it would be extremely powerful. However, if he didn't control it, it would only strengthen the toughness of the landing point. How could it have any destructive power? In other words, even if the fragments of the concept rushed into the range of the civilized country, they wouldn't kill any ordinary creature. With such confidence, why would he care about these fragments flying into the civilized country? In contrast, the 9-headed, 13-armed creature couldn't be like Luo Fan at all. Don't forget what concept the 9-headed, 13-armed creature attached to the sharp awl was. It was the concept of destruction. Whether he could control it or not, this concept would only destroy everything around it no matter where it was placed. If such a concept flew into the civilized country, the impact would definitely be the destruction of a large area of time and space, wiping out a large number of creatures. When that time came, what awaited this creature would obviously be the tribulation of this world. The 9-headed, 13-armed creature's intelligence wasn't low. Soon, it figured out where Luo Fan's confidence came from. For a moment, it was angry and regretful. It was angry because Luo Fan had taken advantage of the situation and attacked while it was weak. On the other hand, it regretted why it had changed the concept of destruction before. It should have changed the concept of toughness to the concept of unbreakability. How good would that be, however, although its emotions were complicated, at this time, the creature could only try its best to dodge the inexplicable power that Luo Fan had sent out, which was changing concepts according to its opponent's movements. On the other hand, it was focused on collecting the concept fragments, trying its best to collect all of them before they flew into the civilized country. Despicable! A soft shout entered Luo Fan's ears. Immediately after, an inexplicable power descended from the void and directly collided with the power that Luo Fan had sent towards the 9-headed, 13-armed creature. At this moment, Luo Fan had transformed the power that he had sent out into a concept of toughness. Meanwhile, the other party had also used a concept of toughness to replace the power. When the two collided, there was naturally a thunderous sound that surpassed everything. Immediately after, the two concepts collapsed at the same time, turning into countless fragments that flew in all directions. However, at this time, the 9-headed, 13-armed creature had finally collected all the concept fragments of destruction. Finally, it avoided the fate of these concept fragments rushing into the civilized country and bringing about its destruction. However, it was looking at Luo Fan with an extremely hateful gaze. What a pity! Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh in his heart. He conveniently collected all the concept fragments and tossed them in front of him. It was constantly changing. After being able to convert power into concepts, it was no longer difficult for him to use the power that he had previously found inconceivable, such as condensing power after it was shattered and returning to its original form. At this moment, he did not even need to use any cultivation technique. He could do it with just a thought. After all, it was transforming power into a certain concept. This was already a sublimation of the power, an application of the potential of the power itself to the limit. Under this kind of application, after the power was shattered, returning to its original form was already extremely superficial. How could it be difficult to achieve this? Luo Fan shifted his gaze and looked at the existence that had saved the 9-headed, 13-armed creature. It was that goat-like creature. The creature looked at Luo Fan and frowned deeply. There was a pondering look in its eyes. Clearly, it was thinking about something. Luo Fan faintly smiled. With a thought, the power in front of him directly turned into an extremely gentle concept. With a slight tremble, it turned into a rope that quickly rushed forward, directly piercing through space and time. It also quickly turned the surrounding true divine mysteries and great path fragments into a rope that quickly rushed towards the goat. Compared to the other creatures, obviously, the goat that knew how to help other creatures was more dangerous. If he wanted to deal with all the other creatures, the order of subduing it should be the first priority. The goat looked at the rope that was coming at it quickly. Without any movement, a layer of water naturally appeared on its body. This layer of water, it was formed by that inexplicable power. Contained within it was the concept of absolute coldness. Within this concept of absolute coldness, everything around it would be frozen, including one's gaze. Therefore, at this moment, when everyone looked through this layer of water to the center, they would see that the goat seemed to have frozen, as though it could not move at all. Moreover, as the concept of absolute coldness spread, the range of this frozen and unchanging area continued to expand and grow. This was obviously because everyone's gaze had been frozen, so they could only see the state of everything within the instant the concept of absolute coldness appeared. It was not that the creature was really floating there, not moving at all. At this moment, the rope that Luo Fan sent out with the concept of absolute coldness directly rushed into the gentle flow of water. In an instant, the concept of absolute coldness and the concept of absolute coldness had a strong conflict. This conflict instantly made the rope crazily twist like a snake. At the same time, it also stopped the expanding trend of the flow of water. Moreover, on the surface of the water, one could see circles of ripples spreading from the point where the rope came into contact with the water. Within the range of the ripples, one could see light and shadow moving, as though time had accelerated. From the moment the creature was submerged by the water until the moment it came into contact with the rope, everything that had happened was accelerated. Compared to the concept of absolute coldness, the concept of absolute coldness that Luo Fan had bestowed on the rope was obviously not enough. During the collision, although the rope showed some signs of breaking through the concept of absolute coldness, it was only signs. During the collision, the rope that Luo Fan sent out was retreating bit by bit, unable to find any hope of breaking through the concept of absolute coldness. After discovering this, Luo Fan knew that the goat-like creature in front of him was probably stronger than the 9-headed, 13-armed creature from before. If he did not use his full strength, it would be very difficult to deal with it. After knowing this, he naturally did not hesitate anymore. He raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. In an instant, the concept of absolute coldness on the rope changed, directly transforming into the concept of absolute coldness. The concept of absolute coldness instantly broke through the obstruction of the flow of water, rushing towards the goat-like creature with incomparable ease and speed. Chapter 1588. Although the penetrating concept that Luo Fan had transformed into was powerful, it was clear that the creature wasn't any weaker. Although it couldn't react in time and allowed the penetrating concept to penetrate the ice concept around its body, it still managed to react before the rope containing the penetrating concept touched its body. It suddenly opened its mouth, and a ray of light shot out from its mouth. It instantly turned into a long needle and shot towards the rope. The long needle contained a obstructing concept. Under this concept, the nature of everything in the surroundings seemed to have changed. Everything formed a strong obstruction to the rope that was charging straight at him, causing the penetration concept on the rope to be constantly disrupted and weakened in the process. Because at this moment the penetrating concept was extremely powerful. At this moment, the goat-like creature's resistance was completely from the bottom of its heart, and its power was extraordinary. In the end, at the very last moment, when the penetrating concept was about to touch its body, the rope finally stopped. Furthermore, the long needle continued to destroy the rope, causing the rope to continuously collapse and be destroyed. Even the fragments that were flying in all directions were reduced to less than a tenth of them. Facing such a change, Luo Fan only had a faint smile on his face. He didn't think that the penetrating concept would be able to deal with the goat-like creature. That was just an extravagant hope under such circumstances. He wasn't the least bit surprised that the rope was stopped. At this moment, his heart moved. With a raise of his hand and a finger, an inexplicable power descended from the void. This time, the power directly transformed into a scorching concept that instantly enveloped the goat-like ice concept that could freeze one's sight. Like a flame, it began to incessantly burn the ice concept. In an instant, indescribable sounds constantly came from above. Time, space, true divine mysteries, and great Tao fragments seemed to be frantically destroyed during this process. With that position as the center, it continued to spread in all directions and destroy that scene. It was unimaginably tragic. In order to resist the concept-piercing rope that Luo Fan had shot out, the goat-like creature had tried its best to stimulate its potential. But now its potential had been stimulated. However, he had yet to fully recover. Compared to when he was at his peak, his control over the large amount of ice concept around him was a little lacking. As the concept of heat and concept of ice collided, the concept of ice was pushed back, shattered, and destroyed. In the end, it produced countless tiny fragments that splashed in all directions. Your concept of scorching heat is advancing at an extremely fast speed, almost in the blink of an eye. It had already reached the level that the concept of penetration could reach, and it was about to come into contact with the goat-like creature's body. At this moment, the goat roared furiously. His body suddenly expanded. Boundless power erupted from its body, directly forming a concept of absolute defense. This concept could defend against and block everything, be it the concept of ice, the concept of heat, the concept of penetration, or the concept of sharpness. As long as the difference in strength was not too great, it could completely defend against everything. This way, it would not harm the body of the goat. Seeing that the goat had suddenly undergone such a change, Luo Fan could not help but narrow his eyes. This was the first time he had seen such a method. It actually condenses its power in its body and only releases it when it is needed. I never thought that there would be such a method. This time, it is really an eye-opener. Such a thought flashed through his mind. At this moment, the concept of heat that he had shot out had already bombarded the body of the huge goat, causing a violent reaction with the concept of absolute defense on the surface of the goat's body. The two concepts were incompatible. The scorching concept wanted to turn everything in it into a part of the scorching heat, while the defensive concept wanted to defend against everything. The collision between the two was almost impossible to hide. As they collided, the concepts scattered in all directions. Moreover, even though the concept of heat was scattering in all directions, it was still tightly entangled with the concept of absolute defense. The concept of absolute defense was still continuously roasting the concepts, still trying to completely turn them into a part of the concept of heat. The concept of absolute defense was still defending against the concept of heat, still trying its best to isolate the concept of heat from affecting the interior of the concept of absolute defense. In this process, between the two concepts, countless changes vaguely condensed into the appearance of an unknown number of worlds. As the changes interweaved, it transformed into an unknown number of inconceivable lights and shadows, displaying an unknown number of marvelous deeds. Between the lights and shadows and the deeds, the two concepts were rapidly consumed. Unknowingly, they gradually disappeared without a trace. However, they did not threaten the range of the civilized country at all. At this moment, the 9-headed, 13-armed creature suddenly roared and raised its 13 arms towards Luo Fan. With a slight tremble, an inexplicable power descended from an unknown place and attached itself to its palms before being released in the direction that its palms were facing. This kind of power was directly converted into the power of destruction in the void, and the direction that it was directed towards was where Luo Fan was. Previously, the goat-like creature had saved it. Now that it saw that the goat-like creature was at a disadvantage, it naturally had to make a move. Faced with this concept of destruction, Luo Fan smiled faintly. With a thought, he casually waved his hand, and a concept of nothingness formed a cage of nothingness out of thin air, instantly enveloping everything in front of it. Not only did it include the concept of destruction, but it also included the 9-headed, 13-armed creature. This also included the goat-like creature that had become extremely huge. At this moment, the other creatures all cried out in alarm. As their bodies moved rapidly, they disappeared from this area in the blink of an eye. This made Luo Fan's original plan of also enveloping them in the concept of nothingness fall through completely. It seems that what they said before has worked. Such a thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind at this time. Of course, these living beings weren't running away because they were afraid of Luo Fan's strength. Instead, they were clearly thinking about what Luo Fan had said before. If he died, it might incite the displeasure of the world, causing the world to descend a tribulation to erase the person who had killed him. Therefore, at this time, he did not want to have a conflict with Luo Fan. He wanted to wait until the matter was over. After thinking in this way, he no longer cared about them. With a thought, he created a teleportation concept at the edge of the cage of nothingness. The concept of teleportation. The edge of the cage of nothingness was directly connected to the civilized country. In that instant, the expressions of both the goat-like creature and the 9-headed, 13-armed creature changed drastically, and they hurriedly withdrew their attacks. Despicable! The 9-headed, 13-armed being roared. At this time, his face was a little pale. He was a little scared, but he was also a little angry. It must be known that he had just launched an attack with all his might. Although he did not intend to completely destroy Luo Fan, he had still planned to cause irreparable injuries to him. Under such circumstances, he suddenly found that his target had become a target that could trigger a tribulation and cause him to be erased by the world. He could only use all his strength to withdraw the attack he had just launched with all his might. And this. It was as if he had used all his strength to attack himself. If it had not been for the fact that he understood these attacks very well and did his best to avoid them, he might have been completely destroyed by his own attack. How could he still maintain his previous calmness? At this time, the goat-like creature's expression was also extremely ugly. Under the scorching heat concept, it could only suppress the absolute defense concept's counterattack. It tried its best to avoid the aftermath of the scorching heat concept from approaching the edge of the cage, preventing the attack from hurting the living beings in the civilized country, and this. It was as if it was dancing with shackles on its legs. One could imagine how uncomfortable it was. If these attacks hurt that living being, you will also be punished by the heavens. Aren't you afraid? After resisting for a while, the goat-like creature finally could not take it anymore and suddenly shouted coldly. Luo Fan naturally knew what it meant. It must be known that although this teleportation concept directly connected this place to the civilized country, it was still the concept that he had cast. If a power was transmitted to the civilized country through this concept and hurt the living beings inside, it would be equivalent to him and that power attacking the civilized country together. If the world would send a tribulation because of this and erase the existence that hurt the living beings in the civilized country, he would also be erased. However, upon hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "My identity is different from yours. I can also be considered a part of them. If I hurt them, it will only be considered an internal injury. How can I be punished by the heavens? If that's the case, the only ones who will die are you." Hearing this, the expressions of the goat-like creature and the 9-headed, 13-armed creature became increasingly unsightly. They could not be sure whether what Luo Fan said was true or not. Although they felt that the possibility of what Luo Fan said was quite high, how could they put this doubt into reality in this life-or-death situation? When Luo Fan saw them hesitating, a faint smile appeared on his face, but he was even more unscrupulous about condensing his power to deal with them. At this moment, the nothingness concept cage turned into a scorching heat concept cage in the blink of an eye. The scorching heat concept that was originally targeted at the goat-like creature completely replaced all the nothingness concepts in the nothingness cage. It completely enveloped all spacetime in the entire range, and even gradually turned spacetime into a scorching heat concept. Under such circumstances, how could the two creatures in this cage continue to dodge like before? They could only rely on their own power to resist this concept. After all, they were more powerful creatures than ordinary desperators. In this resistance, the power that they could guide down transformed into countless mysterious and indescribable changes. Many of these changes were already seen by Luo Fan. He had even grasped some of them. However, there were also many new changes that Luo Fan had never seen before, and he had never even thought of them. These kinds of changes were obviously a new harvest for Luo Fan. During this attack, he felt that he had obtained new improvements almost all the time. He had obtained new progress. As for those two creatures, they didn't choose to recklessly attack Luo Fan at the first moment. That was already certain that it would be difficult for them to muster the courage to attack him recklessly. Therefore, even if Luo Fan's subsequent attacks seemed to be reckless and seemed to be able to completely erase everything, they still continued to resist the impact of the various concepts in this way. Time passed gradually. Unknowingly, a few years had passed. In the past few years, Luo Fan's attacks seemed powerful and terrifying, but in fact, he held back some power. He only forced them to the limit, but he did not really force them to the point of risking their lives to perish together with him. It was also because of Luo Fan's discretion that during this process, the two creatures only displayed the various defensive and offensive methods that they had mastered. But they did not make up their mind to take the risk to test whether Luo Fan would really not be punished by the heavens for attacking the creatures in the civilized country. Of course, the intelligence of these two creatures was not weak. During this process, they gradually understood Luo Fan's thought. Although his life was not in too great of a danger, the sullenness and anger in his heart continued to accumulate. His expression also became more and more irritated. In the civilized country, in the past few years, the war became more and more tragic. The thunderous sounds that came from the void were continuous. It rang out almost every once in a while, as if the heavens and earth were clapping for the war in the civilized country. From the beginning until now, the thunderous sounds had already been heard tens of thousands of times. Such an obvious change attracted the attention of more and more creatures. In the past few years, who knew how many creatures from all over the world allowed their gazes to penetrate the void and enter the civilized country, wanting to peep at what was happening in the civilized country. Evidently, with the protection of the world, it was impossible for these gazes to see anything. When such gazes appeared, there would naturally be thunderbolts descending from the void and naturally extinguishing their gazes, and when these gazes were extinguished, it would naturally make those creatures pay more attention to this place. As a result, they continuously rushed over from all directions. Among them, most of them were powerful creatures from the big organizations, which were similar to the two creatures that Luo Fan circled in front of him. Moreover, these living beings did not appear here in the beginning, but only appeared in succession over the past few years. The reason for this was none other than the fact that they were relatively far from this civilized nation. Apart from the powerful creatures from the big organizations, there were also many creatures from other organizations. Although this was the territory of the big organizations, and generally speaking, they would be offending the big organizations by entering this area. However, the changes that happened here increasingly affected their minds, making them pay more and more attention to it. In the end, many creatures naturally disregarded the conventional wisdom and came here, wanting to observe what was happening in the civilized country with their own eyes and how it would affect them. Now, there were already hundreds of powerful creatures around the civilized country. Moreover, every single one of them was in existence on the same level as the goat and the 9-headed, 13-armed creature. At this moment, they were all looking at the civilized country with resentment and fear in their eyes. In just a few years, so many creatures had come here, and naturally, a considerable number of them had attacked the civilized country. And the results of their attacks were self-evident. Under such circumstances, how could the many creatures gathered here not be shocked by the civilized country in front of them? How could they not guess that the civilized country would affect their status as the protagonists? There were all sorts of guesses. At this moment, it was only natural that they would have such expressions and attitudes toward the civilized country. On this day, Luo Fan's heart jolted. He knew that the war in the civilized country below had truly developed to the final moment. He did not dare to be careless. With a wave of his hand, he instantly threw the 9-headed, 13-armed creature and the goat-like creature out of the cage. He instantly set up a layer of teleportation concept around his body to protect himself. Then, he raised his eyes and looked at the civilized country. He looked over at the final battlefield at the foot of the mountain peak. At this very moment, there were originally countless creatures densely packed on the battlefield, but there were only a few dozen left. Furthermore, every single one of them seemed to be in an extremely sorry state and exhausted. Vaguely, Luo Fan could see that their bodies were already riddled with holes, and almost any creature would completely collapse and turn into powder in the next instant. It was not surprising at all. Finally, this moment. Luo Fan looked at all of this with an inexplicable expression of anticipation on his face. Die. At this moment, a roar came from afar. Then, an indescribable power directly descended on him and blasted the layer of teleportation concept above his body. At this moment, the goat-like creature shouted, "No!" However, it was still a little too late. The power had already been used on the teleportation concept in an instant. The power turned under the teleportation power, and it was transferred into the civilized country. Just as it was about to. It was about to rush into the body of the creature in the civilized country. This power contained the concept of annihilation. If such a concept bombarded anything, it would cause an annihilation effect. Even a false sage would not have any ability to resist such a concept. It would be completely erased by this concept at the first moment. Moreover, most of the creatures in this civilized country were just ordinary creatures. One could imagine that if this concept was really effective, a large portion of this civilized country would definitely be destroyed at the first moment, and it was extremely likely that the entire civilized country would be destroyed in an instant. At that moment, a thunderous sound rang out from the void above. Immediately after, this inexplicable power completely disappeared. Then, a painful shriek came from afar. At the same time, Luo Fan also felt some kind of terrifying power descend on his body, as if it wanted to completely erase his body. As expected, I'll be affected too. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. This kind of power was extremely powerful. If it really used on him without holding back, he would definitely not be able to escape. Fortunately, since he dared to use the teleportation concept on himself, it meant that he had the confidence to deal with it. At this moment, with a thought, his body emitted an indescribable aura. This aura contained an extremely large amount of information and extremely profound principles. It instantly communicated with the world. With the appearance of this aura, the power that descended on his body gradually disappeared, but it did not cause him any injuries at all. It felt like a spring breeze caressing his face. This is indeed effective. Sensing this change, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. The information and principles contained in the aura he emitted just now were to show his identity to the world. His identity as the enlighter of Qing Yi and Yu Ji. His identity as the body structure template provider of all living beings in the civilized country. Such an identity could be said to be equivalent to the creator of all living beings in this civilized country. This naturally gave him great privileges, so he did not need to be punished by the heavens for participating in harming the living beings in the civilized country. After resolving his crisis, Luo Fan turned his head and looked in the direction of the scream. He saw that the scream came from a creature that looked like a turtle-backed ape. At this moment, there was an indescribable cloud surging slightly above its head. Indescribable and unimaginable power continuously poured down from the cloud, enveloping the turtle-backed ape. Under this power, the turtle-backed ape's body continuously dissolved.